On October 21, 2014, in the province of Quebec in Canada, 23-year-old Jenique Delcourt was returning home from work late at night when she made a mistake with fatal consequences. Eager to get home quickly, she decided to use a dimly lit wooded bike path at Old Longueuil on Montreal's South Shore. Half an hour later, police arrived at the Paul Pratt Park to find her unconscious and brutally beaten with a blunt instrument. Hours after she was rushed to the hospital, Jenique was pronounced dead. One suspect's name came up days after her death, and again 1 year later, but no charges could be brought forward due to the lack of evidence. Until nearly a decade later, in May of 2024, someone was finally arrested for Jenique's assault and murder, and it was the same person the police and family had expected. Who killed Jenique Delcourt? What pushed her murderer to do it? Will she ever get justice? Jenique Delcourt was born in 1991 to parents John Gandolfo and Monique Delcourt. She and her older brother Nick shared a happy childhood together until their parents separated and went on to remarry other people. Following the divorce, Jenique began staying with her mother in Longueuil, Quebec, while her father moved to the U.S. Before her death, Jenique was working at a local business called Symbiose Center just a few blocks from her home. She was also looking forward to visiting her father's family at Christmas and spending time in New York. Unfortunately, this dream would never come true for Jenique. On the night of October 21, 2014, Jenique was returning home from work alone when she decided to use a wooded bike path at the Paul Pratt Park near her home at Chemin des Chambly in Old Longueuil. She didn't want to bother her mother for a ride home, and since it was a route she frequently used, Jenique thought nothing of it. But on that fateful Tuesday, she was accosted by a stranger. Sometime later, a passerby found a woman lying battered and still in a pool of blood and called the police. By the time they arrived at the scene around 10 p.m., the woman, later identified as Jenique, had no pulse and had stopped breathing. Emergency operators instructed police on how to perform CPR on her until an ambulance arrived to rush her to the hospital for urgent resuscitation and treatment. However, Jenique's vital signs kept fading, and she died in the early hours of October 22nd. Her death sparked fear into the lives of Longueuil residents. It wasn't the first time a woman had been attacked, but the horrifying nature of Jenique's death was appalling. People worried about their daughters, sisters, and friends, urging them to get home before dark. Police watched as people wondered who would be next. After Jenique was pronounced dead in the hospital, police quickly returned to the crime scene looking for answers. They searched through the cemetery bordering one side of the bike path down to a baseball diamond at the Paul Pratt Park. They did a door-to-door search asking people living in the area if they had heard or seen anything suspicious. The search began around 9:45 a.m. and wrapped up at around 3 p.m. But nothing was found, not even the murder weapon. A witness reported having seen two people running away from the scene before police arrived. They were later caught and questioned, but they weren't involved in the crime. The autopsy of Jenique's body revealed major trauma to the head. Investigators believed Jenique had been hit on the head repeatedly with a blunt instrument, possibly a steel bar. She had also been assaulted, with DNA evidence found on her clothes. On October 25, 2014, a suspect was arrested in connection with Jenique's death. Police suspected the Longueuil resident of acting alone, and he was expected to be charged, but due to a lack of evidence from the forensic tests, he was released by the Crown prosecutor. Then, in February of 2015, a Quebec woman, Caroline Thomas, told police that she had been assaulted on the bike path in Paul Pratt Park on October 19, 2014, just 2 days before Jenique was attacked. According to Caroline, she was walking home from the bus stop near the park when a man got out of a car and approached her. He had forcibly carried her to the car, where he tossed her into the back seat and assaulted her. She said the man covered her mouth and silenced her screams while he hit and violated her for more than 20 minutes. Then he threw her out of the car along with her clothes and drove away. Caroline had somehow made her way back home. Then, early the next morning, she had gone into the Montreal police station near her work to make a report. Unfortunately, her report wasn't taken seriously and transferred to the Longueuil police. She recounted with dismay how the police had asked her a series of inappropriate questions and made her ordeal worse. She also said the police had mentioned calling her back to make a sketch of the suspect, but that had never happened. Longueuil police, however, maintained that Caroline's assault case was taken care of, and there was nothing more to be done. But Caroline was distraught that she wasn't believed, especially after Jenique was attacked in the same vicinity 48 hours later. Caroline felt certain it was her assaulter who had murdered Jenique, and if the police had been more serious, the young woman might not have died. Jenique's family also expressed frustration at the lack of information about the case from the police and the Crown prosecutor. They explained they had learned more about Jenique's murder case from the news than from the authorities, making them feel overlooked. Then, in late 2015, nearly a year after Jenique's murder, new evidence was found. But the police refused to disclose details to the public. They only maintained it was forensic records that were crucial to the case, but still it wasn't sufficient to make an arrest for her murder. Until years later, in 2024. On May 14, 2024, nearly 10 years after Jenique's brutal attack, police arrested Michael McDuff Jalbert for her murder. The 35-year-old man was quickly charged to the Longueuil courtroom on counts of first-degree murder. Jalbert refused to give a statement to the police, but judging by what the police had managed to piece together, they believed that Jalbert had committed the crime, then fled the scene to dispose of the murder weapon, after which he had come back pretending to be a passerby and called 911 himself. Longueuil Police Chief Inspector Pierre Duquette said that the arrest was made after a huge effort from the cold case department that was overseeing the investigation. He refused to give specific details as to what helped them pin the suspect, but he admitted that certain forensic science methods had advanced the case and retrieved new DNA, which allowed them to charge Jalbert for the murder. According to the police, Jalbert, who was 26 years old at the time of the murder, was the one who had alerted police to Jenique's beaten body that night. He was also the suspect who had initially been arrested days after Jenique's murder, but later released due to lack of evidence. However, no conclusive evidence was found to link him to Caroline's assault, so her case was closed. Jalbert was ordered to remain in police custody until the next court hearing, scheduled for July 19, 2024. So far, no new developments have occurred in the case. Now that the case was solved, Jenique's parents expressed their anger that their daughter had been unfairly and brutally murdered by a sick individual. Her father, John Gandolfo, told reporters that though nothing would bring his daughter back, he is glad that her killer will finally be punished. Jenique's older brother, Nick Gandolfo, recounted how his sister was a kind and happy woman who had brought positivity wherever she went. 1 year after Jenique's death, a small commemorative cross and plaque were erected in her memory near the spot in Paul Pratt Park where she was assaulted. Over the years, Longueuil residents would often gather at the bike path for a vigil to remember Jenique by lighting candles and leaving flowers. Some even participated in a 5-kilometer walk as a tribute to her memory. In 2015, Jenique's mother, Monique Delcourt, started an online petition to help the family members of murdered victims get financial support for psychological treatment and therapy.
The mother of a murdered 23-year-old woman says the government isn't doing enough to support victims of crime. That's why Jenique Delcourt has started an online petition. Her daughter Jenique was attacked and killed almost a year ago in Longueuil.
Under Quebec law, she wasn't considered a victim since she wasn't at the scene, which Monique considered unfair. Her plea was later resolved, but to this day, she recounts how difficult it is for her to sleep peacefully, especially when she has 2 more daughters who also have to work. To date, Jalbert hasn't given a reason as to why he murdered Jenique in cold blood. Not that anything would ever be enough reason to kill someone else. Still, one can't help but wonder if the police have any regrets for not keeping him in custody when he was first arrested back in 2014. Regardless, Jenique's family will continue to remember her as a bright and beautiful young woman who had her whole life in front of her before being robbed of it.
Moab police say they have solved a cold case after over 5 decades of unanswered questions.
On March 2, 1973, the partially dressed body of 46-year-old Ann Woodward was found viciously murdered inside the bar she owned with her husband in Moab, Utah. The crime scene showed just how horrific the act was. The police had several suspects, including the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. Unfortunately, the case reached a dead end and went cold. For 51 years, the gruesome murder haunted the small desert town of Moab. In 2024, however, a long-hidden piece of evidence surfaced, resolving the case at last and proving what many had suspected for years. Although Moab has changed a lot over the past 50 years, Woody's Tavern has remained pretty much the same. Since its opening in 1952, it has remained a beloved local establishment. In the 1970s, it was a vibrant hub where cowboys, miners, and individuals from various backgrounds gathered for drinks and socializing. Much of its enduring charm can be attributed to Leslie Woody Woodward and his wife Ann Hammer Woodward, who both owned and managed the venue. Everything was going smoothly until a tragedy struck right within the tavern's walls. On the early morning of March 2, 1973, Woody awoke to find that his wife Ann had not returned home. Ann had been working alone at the bar the previous night and was expected to come back after closing. Fearing that something might be wrong, Woody hurried to the bar, only to be confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. At around 6:45 a.m., Woody entered Woody's Tavern to find an unsettling silence. His heart sank as he discovered Ann's half-dressed body sprawled on the floor between two pool tables. Ann wore only a bra and an unbuttoned blouse, with her pants pulled down. The right leg of her pants, turned inside out and knotted, had been used to strangle her and was still wrapped tightly around her neck. The cash register had been emptied with about $75 missing. Overwhelmed and in shock, Woody reached out to his friend Hecht Bowman, who was the Grand County Sheriff at the time. This was a pivotal point in the investigation. As it turned out, Woody's Tavern didn't fall under the Grand County Sheriff's Office jurisdiction. Instead, it was under the purview of the Moab Police Department. The strained relationship between the two departments significantly impacted the investigation, leading to a series of missteps and mishandling of the case. When Moab Police Chief Melvin Dalton arrived at the scene in 1973, the situation was already in disarray. Despite the Grand County Sheriff's Office being on site, they had failed to properly secure the area, allowing numerous people to enter and exit freely. By the time Dalton's team took over, he feared that crucial evidence from the crime scene had been compromised. The autopsy uncovered additional grim details. The medical examiner reported that Ann had been beaten and assaulted, with her time of death estimated between 1:40 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. Unfortunately, the investigation yielded no leads for an arrest. Despite the setbacks, the Moab police gathered 29 pieces of evidence, including ashtrays, fingernails, hair, fingerprints, and salt shakers. From the outset, the investigation encountered significant challenges. Due to improper processing of the crime scene, there were no clear leads on suspects. Almost everyone who had visited the bar or was a regular at Woody's was considered a potential suspect. Adding to the difficulty, the Moab Police Department lacked the resources and expertise to handle such a complex case. Chief Dalton and his team had no specialized homicide training. Dalton later admitted that with a skilled detective on the case, their chances of solving it might have been significantly improved. Despite these challenges, Dalton did his best. The Moab police managed to identify about 25 potential suspects, and even administered polygraph tests to some of them. However, many suspects hired attorneys and refused to cooperate. The detectives also focused on finding the person who had sat next to Ann, thinking they might be the killer. They sent bar glasses to the FBI for fingerprint analysis, but the results came back inconclusive. Among the many suspects, 3 stood out to the police: 2 local mining workers and Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer, who was active in the 1970s. Bundy became a prime suspect due to his history of assaults and murders of women in the area at that time. However, concrete evidence linking him to Ann's murder was never found, and Bundy never confessed to the crime. Despite lacking formal homicide training, Chief Dalton was ahead of his time when it came to investigative techniques. He collected DNA samples from over 30 people and even retrieved Camel cigarette butts from an ashtray, hoping to analyze them for saliva to determine the suspect's blood type. Although Dalton's forward-thinking approach impressed the FBI, they had to return his box of evidence unopened with a letter stating, "This is a great idea, but we don't have the technology to do that." The DNA and other crucial evidence were preserved, anticipating future advancements in forensic technology. As the years passed and the Moab police made no progress in solving the case, it eventually went cold. Ann's murder left a deep and lasting mark on her family. In a 2006 article, her daughter Susan, who was just 16 at the time of her mother's death, described how that fateful morning marked the beginning of a downward spiral into depression and isolation that still affected her and her siblings. Suzanne shared that her mother's murder traumatized them all in different ways. She felt incredibly isolated and alone. Woody, her father, was devastated by grief. Suzanne's 2 brothers, Max and Bugsy, along with her sister Leslie Ann, struggled with drug and alcohol abuse for years. It became worse when rumors emerged in town suggesting that Woody might have been involved in his wife's murder. The situation deteriorated to the point where it shattered the family. Woody eventually remarried a woman named Jane and decided to sell all the businesses he had started with Ann in Moab, including Woody's Tavern. Leaving the bar where such a tragedy had unfolded brought him some measure of relief. However, the family could never escape the past of not knowing who was responsible for their suffering. Ann Woodward's case held deep personal significance for Chief Melvin Dalton. Even in 1980, when he left the department, the case still occupied a spot on his desk. He maintained contact with Ann's children into the early 2000s. Unfortunately, he passed away, never knowing who had committed the murder. In 2006, Suzanne Woodward reached out to Moab Police Chief Mike Navarre, leading to reopening of the case. By then, DNA technology had advanced significantly, but despite new possibilities, the identity of Ann's killer remained elusive, and the case went cold once more. 16 years later, in 2022, Moab police officer Jeremy Drexler took charge of the investigation and vowed to the Woodward family that he would not rest until he solved the case. On September 14, 2023, Drexler discovered 2 cardboard boxes in the back of a Grand County storage unit containing evidence from the original 1973 investigation. Among the items were Ann's clothes from the night of her murder. These boxes had been relocated from the evidence room to an outbuilding, making them difficult to find. Nevertheless, Drexler meticulously reviewed the contents. By November of 2023, the evidence was sent to the Utah State Crime Lab for analysis. In May of 2024, the results came back, and the DNA on Ann's clothes was positively identified as belonging to Douglas Keith Chudamelka. Interestingly, Chudamelka had been identified as a potential suspect early in the investigation, one of the three main suspects considered at the time. At the age of 25, Chudamelka had come to Utah for mining work and had a criminal record spanning Alabama, California, Iowa, and Nebraska. But what really caught detectives' attention was that his mid-1960s Ford sedan matched the description of the car witnesses saw parked next to Ann's truck on the night of the March 1, 1973 murder. When investigators questioned Chudamelka, he claimed he hadn't been at Woody's Tavern that night, but had spent the evening drinking at the Westerner Grill, another local bar. His girlfriend, a woman named Joyce, provided an alibi, stating that Chudamelka came home around 2 a.m. Although it was possible he could have committed the crime and still made it home by 2 a.m., the bartender at the Westerner Grill contradicted this, stating that Chudamelka was not at the bar on the night of the murder. On July 3, 1973, Chudamelka was arrested for domestic violence. During this time, Joyce told the police that Chudamelka had confessed to killing Ann Woodward and that she planned to share this with the county attorney. However, she later backtracked and refused to provide any further details, only confirming that Chudamelka came home at 4:10 a.m. on March 2nd, not at 2 a.m. Detective Melvin Dalton had collected hair samples from Chudamelka, but there wasn't enough evidence to advance the case. Even when Ann's case was reopened in 2006, detectives attempted to contact Joyce, but she refused to cooperate. After the murder, Chudamelka left Moab and became a truck driver. In 1978, he moved back to Nebraska, his home state, where he lived a quiet life until he passed away in 2002, without ever facing justice for his crimes. Regarding motive, Drexler speculates that Chudamelka may have been enraged after losing money to Ann in a poker game. The $50 she won from him had been taken from her pockets, and Chudamelka paid his rent 2 days later with 5 $20 bills. Although Drexler noted that there's no way to confirm if the rent was paid with the stolen money, it remains a possibility. On June 28, 2024, Drexler revealed in a press conference that Chudamelka's DNA was found on all the buttons of Ann's shirt and on the inside of her pants. This evidence indicated that Chudamelka had removed the pants, thereby confirming beyond a reasonable doubt that he was responsible for both the assault and the murder.
The pants that you can see here, they were white and blue, but when you're looking at the blue portion there, that is the inside of the pants. That is the inside of the pants. It's very, very important to recognize this because this would be brought up. This would be brought up in court if Doug was alive today. The pants, when they were removed, the right leg went inside out. The left leg did not. So when Ann is strangled with her pant leg, it's the inside of her pant leg. So if you're at a bar setting, we can brush against people, you can do transfer DNA. If your pants are inside out, it's impossible to have DNA on the inside.
Additionally, Chudamelka's DNA was found on a glass and on the seat next to where Ann had been sitting just before she was murdered. Detective Drexler stated that if Chudamelka were still alive, he would have faced the consequences of his actions.
If Doug was still alive, he died in 2002, I would certainly ask for an arrest warrant to go to Fremont, Nebraska, and arrest Doug for this crime. There is enough probable cause at this point to charge him with the murder of Ann Woodward from March 2nd, 1973.
Officials announced that Chudamelka's DNA will be entered into the CODES system, a comprehensive network of local, state, and national DNA databases used for tracking convicted offenders. Once Ann Woodward's case is officially closed, this will enable law enforcement agencies across the country to investigate Chudamelka's potential involvement in other unsolved cases. Ann Woodward's granddaughter, Annie Dalton, represented the Woodward family at the press conference, expressing their gratitude to the authorities for finally providing answers after 5 decades of waiting.
Thank you so much for caring enough to go and look for that. And thank you for both agencies for putting aside any history that prevented that collaborative effort. I think this closure has been a long time coming, and I just want to thank all of you that were involved. And if Bowman and Mel Dalton were here, I would thank them as well.
Ann's eldest and last surviving child, Leslie Woodward Estes, who was 18 when her mother was killed, acknowledged that the answers will not bring them full closure.
There's no closure for me. It's still going to go on. She's still going to be gone tomorrow, and my children have never seen her, and they'll never know what a wonderful grandmother she would have been.
But she is relieved that the rumors about her father can now be put to rest.
It broke his heart, but it broke our family. The splinter never was healed. It never really did even begin to heal.
Perhaps now the healing process can finally begin.
Deputy Game Warden Elsworth Arthur Teed. The name may sound a little familiar, probably because he disappeared 90 years ago, but this week there was movement in his cold case. First off, though, who is Teed?
This story unfolds on a Tuesday morning of August 28, 1934, when Elsworth Arthur Teed, a deputy warden for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, followed his usual routine. He said goodbye to his wife Alma and headed to work in his car, a Model A Ford Coupe, with a packed lunch. Little did Alma know it would be their final farewell. Teed informed Alma that he was heading to Boulder Gulch to check reports of poached deer that were hunted out of season, and he would be back in the afternoon for a funeral in town. Alma had patiently awaited her husband's return that day, but he never did return. Worried, she alerted her friends, family, and local authorities when her husband failed to return home. Did Elsworth disappear on purpose, or was there something else involved? And will Teed's family ever discover what really happened to him? Elsworth Arthur Teed, born in Weippe, Clearwater County on November 28, 1894. Elsworth Teed moved with his young bride and children to Mullen, Shoshone County, to embark on a new career as a deputy. Over the years, Teed became intimately familiar with the wilderness around him. Recognized as a skilled outdoorsman, he had found an opportunity in the relatively new profession of deputy game warden. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game, IDFG, established in 1899, initially had struggled to secure a game warden in Shoshone County. Wildlife enforcement was a novel idea for the western states, and wasn't universally embraced back then.
Maybe the first full-time deputy game warden. It was Wild West. People at that time were more readily committing wildlife crimes, and so he was stepping into some risky situations.
In his new role, Teed oversaw wildlife management in the area, enforcing state hunting and fishing regulations. This often involved addressing the illegal hunting of game animals in the out-of-season harvest, a common issue faced during the Great Depression. Teed had taken his position seriously and was considered an effective game warden. Popular with locals, they often provided him with tips about potential poaching. Before he went missing, Deputy Teed had received a tip about possible deer poaching south of Mullen in an area known as Boulder Gulch. On the hot, smoky day of August 28, 1934, he set out in light clothing, parking his car at the base of the gulch near the town cemetery, and leaving his lunch and coat in the passenger seat. When he stepped out of the vehicle, his fate remained a mystery.
There was no specific evidence that was discovered that indicated what had happened, which led to a lot of the speculation.
Knowing that her husband was meticulous about informing her of his plans, Alma had become extremely concerned when he did not return by early afternoon as promised. By early evening, she reported his absence to the Shoshone County local police, fearing he might have been injured or encountered violence while investigating. Authorities quickly found his locked vehicle with his lunch and coat still inside, but no sign of him nearby. His handkerchief was also discovered nearby, along with signs of a struggle. Evidence of poaching, including several deer carcasses, was also found in the vicinity. As darkness approached, the sheriff's deputies decided to wait until the next day to launch a search for him. The following 10 days were marked as the largest search effort in Shoshone County history, utilizing resources from 3 states, planes, bloodhounds, and thousands of search hours. Despite these efforts, very minimal evidence had been found, leaving both the family and law enforcement frustrated. The haunting question remained: would Deputy Game Warden Elsworth Arthur Teed ever be found?
Mines were shutting down so that the workers could go and help with the search. There were, your everyday civilians that were heading into the woods. There was a lot of support and a lot of desire to find him and figure out what happened. So it was kind of a thing that brought the community together to try to figure out what happened to Teed.
On August 28, 1934, the sheriff's posse, comprising approximately 50 officers and volunteers from the area, had commenced the search for evidence of Teed's intended direction from his vehicle. Reports of gunshots from nearby residents raised hopes of a potential distress signal from Teed. Recognizing the urgent need to find Teed alive, Shoshone County Sheriff Fred May had called for additional resources from nearby towns and state offices in Boise as the first day of searching came to an end. The following morning of August 29th saw the arrival of over 200 searchers equipped with advanced search technology. Local pilot Lloyd Donaldson had volunteered to conduct an aerial search with District Forest Ranger E.F. Helmers as his passenger. Ed Kingman from the Walla Walla Penitentiary in Washington had arrived with 2 well-trained tracking bloodhounds to aid in locating the missing deputy. However, the aerial search was brief, lasting only a few hours due to poor visibility caused by a raging forest fire on the St. Joe River. The bloodhounds, accompanied by 10 officers and guides, quickly picked up on a promising trail. Despite their efforts, the scent was lost on the second ridge beyond Boulder Gulch. Exhausted and empty-handed, the search team had returned to town after covering 7 miles. By August 31st, 1934, Deputy Game Warden Teed had been missing for 3 days, and desperation began to grip the searchers. 60 young men from a nearby Civilian Conservation Corps camp, or CCC, had joined the search, swelling the team to nearly 250, including Teed's son and brother. Despite these efforts, doubts about finding Teed began to surface among the searchers, as Teed remained elusive. By September 3rd, Monday evening, officers and the posse members felt defeated and hopeless. No matter their tireless efforts, no evidence of Teed's whereabouts, accidental or criminal, could be found. Rumors suggested that Teed had crossed state lines while tracking the individuals he was investigating and shifted away from Boulder Gulch. This led authorities to pursue leads in neighboring states, but they were unsuccessful. In a gesture of solidarity, the Shoshone County Sportsmen Association offered a cash reward of $100 for information reflecting the community's determination to find Deputy Game Warden Teed. The president of the Shoshone County Sportsmen Association, Ingersoll, stated,
"The sportsmen of the district are very much concerned. In Teed, we had an efficient and aggressive game officer who went about his duties in a thorough manner. If he's been killed in the line of duty by game violators, it is time such criminals are brought to justice, and we propose to use every effort to solve the mystery of his disappearance. If we find his body and it is shown to be met with foul play, the sportsman will give every aid to the state and county officials running down his slayers.
The search for Deputy Teed had lost momentum, with only a few volunteers and groups of young men from the CCC continuing to scour the mountains. Meanwhile, law enforcement had shifted focus on other speculation. Initial inquiries by the Wallace and Kellogg police indicated that Teed had no enemies or disputes. Authorities speculated that he might have sustained an injury and was unable to seek help. A sighting resembling Teed in Paradise, Montana prompted Shoshone County deputies to investigate, but the individual was discovered to be a hitchhiker with no connection to this case. Sensing the investigation coming to a halt, Teed's sister from Kamloops, BC offered an additional $300 reward for information leading to her brother's whereabouts, valid for 30 days. On September 25, 1934, State Game Warden Eckert and North Idaho Game Warden Quarles had returned to Shoshone County announcing hot new clues and reaffirming their commitment to resolving the mystery. An anonymous Spokane resident had contacted the sheriff, claiming to know Teed's whereabouts. The informant, a former colleague of Teed's at the Morning Mine in Mullen, revealed encountering Teed on the way from Republic, Washington, headed towards Canada on September 15th or 16th, 2 weeks after his disappearance. Initially, the informant hesitated to come forward, and later changed his mind, leading to a meeting between the sheriff, game wardens, and the anonymous tipster. Their collective assessment deemed the informant's story substantially correct, with a belief that Teed was alive somewhere in Canada. Despite the commitment to continue the search based on this new lead, no further public updates were provided regarding Deputy Teed's whereabouts. Over 1,000 officers and volunteers had combed the area for weeks, prompting local newspapers to dub it the largest search operation in the state's history. Despite exhaustive efforts, neither Teed nor his remains were ever recovered. On February 6, 1942, the Idaho State District Court officially declared Deputy Teed deceased. Alma Teed was subsequently granted spousal benefits. Deputy Teed's family, which included his wife, 3 sons, and a stepson, were all devastated by this news. For decades, the case remained unsolved. Finally, in February of 2023, Idaho Fish and Game honored Deputy Teed and accepted him into the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Idaho Peace Officers Memorial. His service was officially recognized as having been lost in the line of duty on the day of his disappearance in 1934. This information was announced in a news release on the agency's website. The announcement got the attention of local news stations, prompting individuals to reach out to the sheriff's office to inquire about the circumstances surrounding Teed's disappearance. A routine press release preceding the state ceremony on May 18, 2023, had prompted an unidentified witness to come forward with new information. Sheriff's Office Captain Seth Green stated that what was initially dismissed as a family story about the game warden's death, passed down for generations, now seemed to be more credible. The Shoshone County Sheriff's Office received information from 4 unidentified individuals regarding the events surrounding Teed's disappearance. George Pentland, his teenage son John Robert Pentland, and another teenager named Oscar Downing were reportedly poaching deer in the Mullen area when they had encountered Teed. George Pentland allegedly killed Teed, with the 2 boys assisting in disposing of his body. The Shoshone County Sheriff's Office declared the case closed after all the witnesses shared similar testimonies. Neither the names nor the statements of the witnesses were disclosed. Sheriff's Office Captain Seth Green explained, "We verified the individuals' family histories, conducted interviews, and found consistency in their accounts, which were independently corroborated. He further emphasized that the information provided by the witnesses was compelling, as each person offered detailed and consistent narratives of the alleged homicide of Teed. Despite the closure of the case, the sheriff's office had declined to release witness statements or further details regarding the alleged homicide. Furthermore, they announced they would not conduct a search for Teed's remains. They cited environmental factors like fires and heavy rains over the years, which may have moved the remains to a completely different area. Reflecting on the case's resolution, Sheriff's Office Captain Green expressed satisfaction at having answers to a nearly 90-year-old cold case, stating, "It's gratifying to bring some closure. His team and Fish and Game were determined to get to the bottom of it." Investigator Adeline Watkins from Idaho Fish and Game noted the case's uniqueness due to its circumstances with no police reports available. Investigators had relied on newspaper records and oral accounts. Watkins expressed that despite the case being officially closed, more individuals might come forward with additional information. She emphasized the significance of the breakthrough for the Teed family, stating, "For the family, it was closure." Elsworth Teed was the great-uncle of Melissa Seller Teed's husband, and she knew Teed's 3 sons. She had stated that they would often discuss their father and how they wished they knew if he was killed in an accident or at the hands of someone else. When Teed disappeared, his sons, aged 8 to 14, had to grow up without their father, and passed away without ever discovering his fate. On February 6, 2024, Dave Teed, Elsworth Teed's grandnephew, wrote, he never had the pleasure of his uncle's company, but hoped to see him again. On February 17, 2024, retired Detective Steve Rizzo of Delaware State Police wrote, "The Vidocq Society recently announced the closure of Deputy Teed's case, revealing the identities of his attackers. It is a great honor to reflect on his heroic action and to express gratitude for his service and sacrifice. We hope he can now rest peacefully, and his loved ones can find comfort knowing that his case has been solved. He will always be remembered by his law enforcement family." Deputy Teed had quite evidently left a long-standing mark on his loved ones, who look back on his memories with utter respect. Deputy Elsworth Arthur Teed lived honorably, by consistently doing the right thing. His story will forever remain a testament to integrity and morality. Though it took 90 years for his family to find closure after his untimely death, the revelation finally brought them peace. Until the fall of 1986, 27-year-old Barbara Villaral lived a peaceful life with her husband in Garland, Texas, and enjoyed her job as an accountant. But on November 7th of that year, the unthinkable happened. Barbara was found brutally stabbed to death in her home on Cobalt Drive, about 20 miles from Dallas. The weapon, a large knife from her own kitchen. Police were quick to question her husband, Domingo Diaz Villaral, since he was the only one present at the crime scene. But he spun a tale that left detectives confused. Forced to release him with no evidence or new leads, the case went cold for nearly 35 years. Barbara's murderer remained at large, even as her family desperately sought answers. Until a new detective reopened the case in 2019 and decided to run the data from the 1986 crime scene using genetic genealogy. Luckily, there was a match. Someone whose blood and fingerprints were at the crime scene that horrible day. Someone close to Barbara. Who was it? How was the killer found? Why did he do it? Barbara was born in 1959 as the youngest of 4 children in a large and tight-knit Midwestern family, living in 12 Mile, Indiana. After her father's death and her mother's remarriage, Barbara became part of a blended family with 2 more step-siblings. Affectionately called Barb or Barbie, she was a kind and sweet person who got along with everyone. As a child, she spent her holidays with cousins, riding bicycles to her grandmother's shop for lilies, going fishing and swimming in the lake. She enjoyed cooking and often made hearty meals to share with her family and relatives. In 1979, Barbara got married to Domingo Diaz Villaral, and the couple moved from Illinois to Dallas to start a new life. She started working as an accountant at an oil consulting company, DeGloyer & McNaughton. It was here that she met Lisa Nugent, and the pair became fast friends, eating lunch together nearly every day. Barbara missed her family back in Indiana and would travel to meet them whenever she could. But no one could have foreseen the tragedy that lay in store for Barbara and her loved one. On the evening of November 7, 1986, Barbara and her husband went out for dinner and returned home late at night. Not tired enough for sleep, they decided to stay up a bit longer and enjoy each other's company. Little did they know, they were not alone. According to Domingo, he went out to get something for both of them and came back to a shocking sight. His wife Barbara was being attacked inside their own home by an intruder. Domingo tried to intervene, but he was overpowered and tied up. By the time he managed to escape and alert the neighbors, the intruder had fled, leaving Barbara injured and unconscious. Minutes after a 911 call, police arrived at the address. They found a blood trail outside the home, and inside, in a back room, was Barbara. She had been stabbed numerous times with a kitchen knife, which was lying beside her. Unfortunately, it was too late to help Barbara. She had died from the injuries inflicted by the unknown intruder. Police identified the presence of 2 distinct blood types at the crime scene. One was Barbara's, and the other was believed to belong to the killer. The autopsy of Barbara's body revealed that she had been stabbed multiple times, with the knife found beside her. There were also scratches on her body, which indicated she had struggled before finally succumbing to her injury. Police quickly interrogated her 32-year-old husband, Domingo, who was the only witness. They suspected him initially, when neighbors revealed that Barbara and Domingo had a troubled marriage. But Domingo had an alibi. He had gone out to get snacks. Plus, there were no injuries on him to suggest any signs of a struggle. When a blood test showed no match with the killer sample from the crime scene, he was promptly released. Police looked for new leads, but their attempts were in vain. Back in 1986, there was no reliable way to link the blood found in the crime scene to anyone. This singular fact hindered and eventually stopped the investigation of the case. Years passed without any breakthrough, even as Barbara's mother and siblings struggled to accept her loss. 2 years after Barbara's death, her husband Domingo was killed in a shootout in Mexico. With the only witness now dead, Barbara's case went cold. In late 2019, police reopened the case. Detective Lucas Shoup and his team thumbed through the case notes, hoping to find new information about what had happened that night. They went back to the interviews conducted in 1986 and reassessed everyone's statements, including Domingo's. Further investigation later revealed a strange fact. Domingo Villarreal's real name was Jesus Canales.
However, years later, through fingerprint analysis, detectives discovered Domingo's real name was Jesus Canales, and investigators say that led them to his brother, Laborio Canales.
However, there were no records as to why he had changed his name, and since he was no longer alive to be questioned, that lead went cold. In 2023, when everything else failed, detectives decided to process the blood and fingerprints found in and outside the Villarreal's home, using a technology known as genetic genealogy.
And Barbara Villaral's family, the victim in this case, they flew to North Texas from Indiana for those victim impact statements today. They said on the stand that they finally have closure, and then they went on to thank the generations of Garland detectives and the Dallas County DA who all did not give up.
A tool used to analyze DNA and compare it against people with similar or matching DNA patterns. Using this tool, they scanned the FBI's criminal justice database, called Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS. According to the police, they made use of this technology in order to find out if anyone from the Villaral family was linked to the crime. Luckily, they found a match, linking to her husband. However, he wasn't the murderer. It was someone he knew, someone related to him by blood. DNA testing of the blood found at the crime scene was a complete match to 86-year-old Liborio Canales. Without doubt, he had been present at Barbara's home on the day she was killed. In July 2023, police arrested Canales when he crossed the border from Mexico, while on his way to Lovington, New Mexico for his birthday celebration. They interrogated him only to discover a shocking tale. Liborio Canales was Domingo's brother, making him Barbara's brother-in-law and a member of her family. It didn't take long for Canales to admit to the murder after being detained at the Lea County Detention Center, which left Barbara's family shocked. According to him, the murder had been an act of revenge, following an argument that Canales had had with Barbara and Domingo, which had left him upset. After the murder, he had moved to a small town and kept a low profile for years, before finally moving to Mexico as a citizen. Still, he usually traveled between Mexico and the USA to spend time with family, which allowed the police to apprehend and arrest him. Following his candid admission, Canales was quickly taken to court and placed on a $1 million bail. In July of 2024, he was charged in court for the first-degree murder of Barbara Villaral. Once again, he pleaded guilty, and when asked why he had done it, Canales revealed he had given a loan to the Villarals, which they had refused to pay back. This led to the heated argument over the phone, and he later came into town and got into a fight with Barbara, ultimately leading to her murder. Liborio Canales was given a 20-year sentence for the first-degree murder of Barbara Villaral. This was the first murder conviction in Dallas County that had used genetic genealogy to provide evidence. The attorney, John Cruzat, expressed pleasure at the fact that investigative genetic genealogy was no longer in the future, but was actively being used to solve violent crimes. The lead prosecutor, Leighton D'Antoni, praised the attitude of Barbara's family and the work of detectives in staying on top of the case and making sure the killer was found after such a long time. He believed that genetic technology could help secure convictions more easily. He also stressed that justice was finally served, even if delayed.
Until a new forensic technique matched a decades-old blood sample to now 86-year-old Liborio Canales. Canales, a Mexican citizen, is the victim's brother-in-law.
I would like to think that this case could show the public that police departments don't forget, and that they do continue to work and try to bring some sort of closure to the families, he said. Barbara's sister-in-law, Jennifer Dunderman, was unable to process her shock. "You spent 37 years living your life as if nothing had happened," she said to Canales in the courtroom amid tears. "The life you lived should be considered a gift. You didn't just kill Barb, you killed a little piece of everyone she knew." Barbara's mother, who was 94 years old at the time of the trial, was relieved that she would finally get closure before passing away. Barbara's brother, however, still grieved her loss. "It doesn't really change anything, though. We still don't have our sister. But it is nice to have closure," he said. He further disclosed that for years after the murder, they suspected that someone close to Domingo knew more about what happened. In fact, they even believed the crime might have been planned between the two brothers. Barbara's friend, Lisa Nugent, recounted her experience with Barbara, maintaining that she was a great friend and a great employee. "We had fun together, and I missed her so much over all these years. She was a wonderful friend to me, and I was blessed," she said. Barbara's relatives continue to cherish the memories they have of her, admitting to still cooking some of the recipes she shared with them during her short life. One of her nieces has given her daughter a middle name that begins with B to honor Barbara. Nearly every day since her death, Barbara's family have revisited photographs and memories. Their favorites include a newspaper clipping of 9-year-old Barbara and her older sister Kathy at a 4-H talent show, a group photo from her high school graduation, and the autograph she got from Patrick Duffy, the main actor in her favorite show, Dallas. Considering how troubled Barbara's marriage was, and Canales' vague reason as to why he killed her, one can't help but wonder if her husband Domingo knew more than he said. After all, why change your name and move to a new place? Why say you saw intruders when it was your own brother at the scene? There were certainly things about his statement that didn't add up, but unfortunately, he died way before his brother was brought to justice. Regardless, Barbara's murderer was found and charged, even though he got to live his life freely for 36 years after committing the heinous act. Barbara's family is happy for the closure they have received, and they want her to be remembered for her kind heart and big smile. On November 11, 1988, the tranquil city of Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island was struck by tragedy. Byron Carr, a 36-year-old high school teacher, was found dead, lying on his bed, brutally stabbed. He missed a family gathering, which prompted this finding, and a quick check turned out to be cruel.
Front door was locked, and we went around all the windows, and they were locked, and all the curtains were closed. And I just said to Wally, well, we'll break the basement window like we have to get in. I mean, that's... So Wally went around back, and the back door was open. So he went in and let me in the front door, and we found Barn.
During the police investigation, a surprising revelation emerged. Byron had been hiding a secret, one he had concealed from nearly everyone, including his closest family members. What was the secret Byron had guarded so closely? And could it hold the key to solving this mystery? Byron's family was worried on Friday, November 11, 1988, when they couldn't get through with phone calls on the evening of their gathering and he didn't show up. They then made the decision to visit him at his Charlottetown home on November 12th. Upon reaching Byron's residence, they discovered that the rear entrance was unlocked. The house appeared untouched from the inside. Dishes were on the counter and his dog barked from its kennel. However, Byron had vanished from sight. They walked over to his bedroom door, and they found Byron lying on the bed there. He had passed away long ago. They discovered he had been stabbed. Their first disbelief gave way to horror.
At first, we didn't see the knife. I think it was kind of weird just standing in the hallway. And I just went to the phone and we called an ambulance, and then when we took another look and saw the knife and everything, then I just went back to the phone and called. Well, I just called the operator and she got the police. I didn't know the police number. And we called the police and they were there within 5 minutes or so.
The police's arrival prompted an in-depth investigation. It was discovered by investigators that Byron had been strangled and that the stab wound had been inflicted after his death. Police found important evidence among the items in Byron's home: a pair of socks that had been thrown in the trash, and an unusual pair of underwear were discovered at the site. These were bagged for more investigation because they just didn't seem right. When it was discovered that the underwear contained male body fluid from an unidentified man, even Byron's family was horrified to learn the truth. Before he was killed, Byron who identified as gay, had had a close relationship with a man. The cops talked to his friends to find out his last hours. They discovered that Byron had had coffee with them that evening on November 10th. He had left later to go and see other pals in Charlottetown. He was spotted socializing and having fun at a few pubs that evening, according to witnesses. According to accounts from his friends, Byron picked up a friend and drove them home just before 3 in the morning on November 11th, which is when he was last seen. How was a guy found dead in his own bed after leaving the house for a fun-filled night out? The cops were baffled by the case's circumstances. The search was complicated by Byron's sexual orientation. Friends and witnesses were reluctant to come forward because they were worried about being publicly identified in a community that was not as welcoming of LGBTQ+ people. These elements had a part in the case fast becoming cold. Because of Byron's sexual orientation, some individuals even thought the police weren't treating the case seriously.
Why is the case gone unsolved? What are they doing about it? Are the files closed? Will it ever be solved? Are they treating it as, oh, well, it's just another faggot gone down the drain, one less to worry about? Or are there people back there who really tried, and who's trying now? Why isn't the case solved?
Years would pass before the Charlottetown police made a discovery that would enable them to piece together the details of Byron's final known sighting. When critical information surfaced in 2008, the inquiry dramatically changed course 2 decades after the case had become cold. One eyewitness claimed to have spotted Byron in the early hours of November 11, 1988, not long before he passed away. The witness stated that at approximately 3 in the morning, Byron had pulled over to speak with a man riding a bicycle. Following their short exchange, Byron had gone back toward his house, and the biker had gone the same way, apparently following Byron there as well. Although this material provided fresh insight into the crime, investigators were initially skeptical because it had appeared 20 years later. However, they knew they had a significant lead when the witness cleared a polygraph examination. Police believed that Byron was followed home by this unidentified cyclist, after which the two had had sex. But now, things had gone horribly wrong, and this unidentified man had killed Byron by strangulation. In the years that followed, other witnesses came forward, adding to the mystery. On the evening of November 11th, one person claimed to have observed an unknown car parked outside of Byron's house for a while, before it was quickly driven away. This gave the impression that the murderer had visited Byron's home again later in the day. The murderer, according to the police, either met up with an accomplice at Byron's residence on November 11th, or had returned on his own. They had come back to tidy up the area and get rid of any evidence, including DNA and fingerprints. In order to not leave any evidence, they wore socks. Long after Byron was dead, one of them had stabbed him, possibly to make a more graphic mark. The two had then left the area. One of Byron's old students then made a crucial discovery. There was a mysterious individual who was obsessed with Byron.
That really stands out in my mind, like maybe during those last few months, was Byron telling me about this man who would routinely phone him, who it appeared wanted some sort of relationship, be it long-term, short-term, I don't know. But that Byron was not comfortable being associated with this person. And I remember one evening, Byron said he was just lying on the couch watching television and he fell asleep. And when he woke up, this man was in his house.
Sadly, this didn't really help, and the search ultimately ended up back where it had begun. In an attempt to solve the unsolved crime, investigators then created a profile of the murderer. The murderer was believed to be a young man, perhaps in his early 20s or early 30s, who had a high-risk lifestyle in Charlottetown. They thought the murderer was gay or bisexual and might have had a past of small-time crimes. The two most significant pieces of evidence discovered at the scene were a handwritten letter that said, "I will kill again," and a pair of strange underwear. An examination of the perpetrator's handwriting showed that they had a unique writing style with dotted circles over the eyes and circular motions. Investigators, however, thought the note was more of an angry outburst than a serious threat. According to the scenario, the murderer and his accomplice had gone back to the house in pursuit of the underpants that had been accidentally left behind following their first meeting with Byron. They became enraged and abandoned the threatening note after failing to locate it. The recovered underwear was found to be a medium-sized 29.5-inch waisted Zellers brand bikini. Years later, in the 2000s, technical developments allowed the researchers to recover DNA from the fabric sample by analyzing the male body fluids. The results showed that the DNA did not belong to Byron and did not match anyone in the national database, which is a strong indicator that the murderer was the owner. DNA was also found in the abandoned pair of socks, which was another important piece of evidence. Police kept the identity of the individual who had worn the socks a secret, even though they were able to identify them. This person was the killer's accomplice, but the investigation came to a regrettable stop because they had passed away in the late 1990s. No matter how long it took, the Charlottetown police were still committed to finding Byron's killer. They obtained DNA samples from all those who might have been associated with Byron, including guys he could have come across at the pubs that evening, but they were unable to find a match. Two mysterious phone calls from an unidentified male were made to the police in 2018, close to Charlottetown Mall. His voice was urgent, as he claimed to know essential details about Byron's murder. But as swiftly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving no sign of who he was or how to get in touch with him. Over 30 years had gone by since Byron's terrible death, yet the truth was still elusive. Even though the authorities thought they had found the accomplice, Byron's killer's identity remained a mystery. Then, out of the blue, a discovery was made that gave the inquiry a fresh start. The Byron Carr murder case gave authorities some hope after 35 long years. In the spring of 2022, investigators made a risk. They examined the evidence from the scene of the crime again and tested the underwear's genetic makeup. In an attempt to match the DNA profile with the killer's family, this meant uploading it to databases used for genetic testing. Although it took a while, the effort paid off. The police finally had a lead in January of 2024.
At 11:55 a.m. yesterday morning, the Charlottetown Police Services arrested Todd Joseph Gallant, age 56, of Surrey.
At the time of the murder, Todd Joseph Gallant, who is currently 56 years old, would have only been 21. For many, memories of that horrific November day in 1988 undoubtedly returned. The name Gallant was not unfamiliar to the investigators. He was convicted of breaking and entering in Prince Edward Island back in 1987. He had lived in Charlottetown then, not far from Byron Carr. Shortly after the murder, he relocated to the U.S. and eventually made his way back to Charlottetown in 2022. Gallant was detained on January 26, 2024 in connection with the murder of Byron Carr. He was accused of first-degree murder and interfering with human remains. Things were beginning to come together. But the questions outweighed the solutions. What had actually occurred that evening? What could have been the motivation for Gallant's crime? The family of Byron is still waiting on justice. As soon as Gallant was formally charged with the murder by the Charlottetown police, John, Byron's brother, shed tears. John talked about his brother with much affection.
Been a long 35 years. Sad that the case went on for 35 years. Both our parents, mom and dad, have passed away and weren't here to take part in this process today. This would have been very important to them as the next step in pursuing justice for Byron.
Prejudices in society and the fear of outing witnesses presented numerous difficulties for the investigation, leaving many unsolved questions. They are holding out hope that Gallant's sentencing will resolve this long-running case and spotlight the larger problems of prejudice and violence against the LGBTQ+ community as the trial approaches. Is there more to the story? Or was Byron Carr's murder motivated by hatred because of his sexual orientation? Though it is now hidden, the truth will eventually come to light.
On March 22, 1987, the lifeless body of 28-year-old Derby Wagner Richardson was discovered in the trunk of her own car, shocking her community. Derby, a security guard, had been forcibly removed from her workplace, Steiberg Engineering. During a violent struggle, her throat and her wrists were really in a bad condition. For over a decade, the killer of a young woman evaded capture. It took an astonishing 37 years before the man responsible for her untimely death was finally brought to justice. This is the haunting story of a lively, energetic woman whose life was tragically cut short. Her murder left behind a mystery that confused investigators for years as they tried to figure out who killed her. What motivated someone to carry out such a brutal attack on Derby, a lively and compassionate person well loved by her friends and community? How was the perpetrator able to avoid justice for 37 years, despite leaving footprints at the crime scene? Let's look into the details of this mystery. Born on May 2, 1958, at Bosco Bell, Grant County, Wisconsin, Derby, at the age of 16, married Fred Wagner Richardson, and they had 2 daughters together. She worked 3 jobs, including at a nursing center in Kenosha and as a YWCA instructor in Racine, to give her daughters the best life. Despite facing domestic violence in her marriage to Fred, she stayed for their children. However, the abuse worsened, and for her and her children's safety, Derby decided to leave Fred in June 1986 and filed for divorce in December. Derby Wagner Richardson was working as a third-shift security guard at Steiberg Engineering. On a typical night of March 22, 1987, when she failed to check in at her usual time of 1 a.m., the company management immediately grew concerned and contacted the Racine Police Department to report her as a missing person. Her co-workers at Steiberg Engineering sensed something was wrong, but they could not have imagined the true gravity of the situation unfolding. When the investigators arrived at the workplace of Derby, she was nowhere to be found. They found many pieces of evidence suggesting she had been taken against her will after a struggle. Little did anyone know at the time that the gruesome fate that awaited Derby was about to unfold. On a typical morning of March 22, 1987, at around 8:30 a.m., just a few hours after Derby was reported missing, her car was discovered in an alley near Layard Avenue, just north of Steiberg. In a shocking discovery, when police opened the trunk of her car, they found the victim's lifeless body. She was nude with white duct tape gagging her mouth. Her throat and wrist had been badly slashed, almost resulting in decapitation, highlighting the severity of the assault. The following day, authorities found Derby's scattered clothes along the street. These included her tan uniform, security badge, and a shoulder patch from her uniform and a brown shoe.
Search parties were out on the west side of Racine today, looking for clues, for evidence, perhaps a murder weapon.
they had little luck. Still missing are the tan or brown uniform pants Derby Richardson was wearing, her keys, and possibly a purse.
Yesterday, police found many clues. They found personal papers belonging to the woman strewn along the side of the road as if someone had tossed them out of a car. Police say they also found a security guard patch that looked as if it had been ripped off of her shirt. Now, these items were found on Spring Street in between Island and Lewdkey, the opposite side of town from where the woman's body was found.
Investigators also found a pair of black and red bolt cutters at the crime scene. Despite DNA analysis not being widely known at the time, all evidence was well preserved. A medical examiner later concluded that the injury to her head was probably caused by the bolt cutters. The thorough investigation started. The investigators determined that robbery was not the motive, as the victim's jewelry remained intact. Furthermore, there were no signs of sexual assault found during the examination of the crime scene.
We realized that the victim was not killed at the location she was found. So if there's a substantial amount of blood in a confined area, this would be the crime scene. And we're asking anybody, if they do find an area that looks like this, to give us a call.
Police say Derby Richardson had worked as a security guard for the past 8 months. The mother of 2, she was separated from her husband. An autopsy report shows that Derby Richardson had her throat cut. There was no evidence of sexual assault, but there were cuts on her arms as if she tried to protect herself. Police are also investigating reports that Richardson had been threatened the past few months.
We have also received the information that she did receive threats, and at this time we are checking them out.
Racine police are asking that you call them with any information or evidence. Right now, they can find no suspect and no motive.
A pair of bolt cutters found at the crime scene suggested that the suspect had used them to gain entry to the Steiberg Engineering property. Crime scene photographs revealed a shoe print on the property with a pointed toe, resembling a type of cowboy boot. These pieces of physical evidence indicated that the suspect had cut through a section of the chain-link fence along the east side of the property to access the premises. The bolt cutters and the distinctive shoe print provided investigators with important clues about how the suspect had entered the scene. According to the investigation, Derby had a routine of bringing her children's laundry to work to fold. She would often park her car near the lunchroom door to easily carry the laundry basket back and forth. It seemed the perpetrator was waiting for Derby and attacked her during one of these trips. Her jacket was found with the sleeves turned inside out, suggesting a struggle had taken place. Examination revealed the assailant had tried to grab Derby from behind. However, Derby was able to break free and flee towards a nearby office, locking herself inside. Marks on the office door showed someone, likely wearing a denim jacket, had repeatedly rammed the door with their shoulder in an attempt to get to Derby. In the end, the assailant was able to overpower Derby and knock her unconscious. They then taped her mouth shut with duct tape before taking her, most likely in the trunk of her own car. The main suspect in Derby Wagner Richardson's murder was her husband, Fred Wagner Richardson. Their marriage had been violent, with Fred physically hurting Derby many times. Just a couple of months before the murder in January 1987, Fred allegedly strangled Derby in front of their daughter, making her pass out. He also punched her so hard that he broke his own hand. Investigators found out that just 12 hours before Derby's brutal attack, she and her husband Fred met with her lawyers to finalize their divorce. This meeting, which involved a heated discussion about the settlement, seemed to be a major tipping point. Fred stood to lose a significant portion of his income and assets, including half of their properties and 25% of the rental income, totaling around $250,000. The discussion upset Fred so much that Derby's attorney requested extra protection from her from the authorities. The financial stakes involved in the divorce proceedings appear to have been a key factor that exacerbated the conflict between Derby and Fred in the final hours before her horrific death. However, despite suspicions about Fred's involvement, investigators were unable to find sufficient evidence to charge him with murder. The case eventually went cold, leaving Derby's family without closure. Unfortunately, the search for Derby's murderer didn't reveal any leads. By the end of the year, detectives couldn't charge anyone with the crime, and the case became unsolved and forgotten. They preserved all the collected evidence with care, hoping that advancements in technology might open up new possibilities for testing and analysis. Sadly, after Derby was murdered, her case remained unsolved for 37 years. Even though there were signs of a struggle and long-standing suspicions about Derby's husband, Fred Wagner Richardson, being involved, the police had no evidence linking him to the crime. But on March 28, 2024, police searched Fred's home following a tip that he, as a felon, possessed firearms. They found 4 handguns and 2 tasers.
Years and 6 days after Derby Wagner Richardson's body was found, Racine police say they executed a search warrant at Frederick Wagner Richardson's properties, including this building off of Mound Avenue. And inside, police say they found a set of bolt cutters identical to those found in the days after Derby's death and those that Frederick bought the month after she died.
Additionally, they recovered a pair of bolt cutters that matched the ones from the 1987 crime scene, and a pair he had bought shortly after Derby's death. So Fred was arrested on March 28, 2024, after the Racine police allegedly recovered firearms. However, when he was arrested for new charges of illegal firearm possession, authorities were able to reopen Derby's murder case. Former Texas prosecutor Kelly Siegler and cold justice regular homicide investigator Steve Spingola teamed up with the Racine Police Department in Wisconsin to investigate Derby's death once again. The investigator hoped to finally unravel the enduring mystery that had haunted them for so long. Investigators said that the possible motive to kill Derby was that Fred Wagner Richardson was especially angry about losing income from his rental properties because of the divorce. Investigators also said that 83-year-old Fred Wagner Richardson was always the main suspect in his wife's murder. They believed they had a motive to kill Derby Wagner Richardson after several years of a troubled marriage. The cold justice investigation included interviews with many of Derby's friends and co-workers. One of these was Kelly Williams Cherry, who had watched Derby's children on the night of her murder. She told investigators that every time she left the house, she'd always say, "Please, under no circumstances, if he ever comes over here, do not open the door for Fred. I don't want him nowhere near the girls." Investigators also found out that Fred reportedly made statements about his whereabouts when his estranged wife died that turned out to be false. He told one friend he would be occupied with his children over the weekend, but it was actually Derby's turn to have them. He also told another friend he was sick in bed all weekend, which was inconsistent with other evidence. This renewed investigation into Derby Wagner Richardson's murder in 1987 ultimately resulted in new charges being filed against the suspect. Despite being the prime suspect in Derby's murder for nearly 37 years, Wagner Richardson was never charged until now. Fred Wagner Richardson was 18 years older than Derby and the father of her 2 daughters. By the age of 30, Fred had a lengthy criminal record, allegedly joining the U.S. military under a false name. He was dishonorably discharged after attacking and robbing someone, leading to a prison sentence. After moving to Racine, he was convicted of 2 more robberies, but served only part of a 15-year sentence. This pattern of violence and criminal behavior was a sign of the troubles to come in his relationship with Derby. Fred Wagner Richardson, an 83-year-old man, had been charged with first-degree murder for the 1987 killing of his estranged wife, Derby Wagner Richardson. He will face a potential life sentence if convicted of this murder charge. In addition to the murder charge, Fred also faced several other felony charges in a separate pending case. These include 4 counts of possession of a firearm by a felon and 2 counts of possession of an electronic weapon. He made his initial court appearance on these charges on April 1, 2024. Prosecutors asked for $1 million bail for Fred Wagner Richardson. The court commissioner set it at $50,000 cash and a $50,000 signature bond. Despite the serious nature of the charges, Fred was released from custody after posting the $50,000 bond. He is expected to appear in court again for a preliminary hearing on April 10, 2024. The decision to grant bail, even on such a serious charge, was likely based on Wagner Richardson's advanced age and the length of time that had passed since the alleged crime. However, this has raised concerns among Derby Wagner Richardson's family and the broader community about the potential risk of allowing the suspect to remain free. The arrest and charges against Fred Wagner Richardson for the 1987 murder of his wife Derby represent the resolution of a long-standing mystery. This development demonstrates the unwavering dedication of law enforcement to keep their community safe and solve even the most challenging cold cases. Derby's aunt, Ellie Schmidt, expressed deep gratitude to the investigators for finally bringing closure to the family after over 37 years.
Ideally, it would be my sister, Ruth, standing here. She fought so hard and for so long to get justice for her daughter's murder that I can speak for our entire family in expressing deep gratitude to everyone who was involved in making it possible for us to be here today.
After over 37 years, investigators were able to build a strong case against Fred, the primary suspect from the beginning. Their tireless efforts to re-examine the evidence and pursue new leads allowed them to finally bring charges against the 83-year-old for Derby's brutal murder. As the case of Derby's murder finds some closure after many years, we reflect on the emotion that this revelation stirs. Cases like Derby Wagner Richardson's murder demonstrate just how difficult it can be to solve cold cases, even with a thorough initial investigation. It also emphasizes the need for justice and closure for the victims' families and the community. Cases like Derby's serve as a sobering reminder that justice is not always swift, but that law enforcement will never give up on seeking answers, even in the face of immense challenges.
On April 11, 1968, 47-year-old Hiram Gryam, a milkman, set off on his usual route, but did not return home. Concerned, the milk company filed a missing persons report that evening when Graham's truck did not come back, long after he should have completed his deliveries. After an extensive search yielded no results, he was discovered the next day with the aid of an aerial search deep in the woods of Vero Beach, Florida. Hiram Gryam was found lying next to his milk truck, having been shot 3 times in an execution-style killing. Further investigation revealed that Gryam was a World War II veteran. His murder occurring just days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. raised suspicions about a potential connection to the period's racial tensions and violence. Who might have wanted him dead? What circumstances led to his tragic end? Hiram Gryam was involved in the Battle of the Bulge, which took place on the Western Front between the U.S. Army and Germany near the conclusion of World War II. The President awarded Gryam the Purple Heart Medal, which is awarded to troops who make significant personal sacrifices while fighting. Later on, he held positions as Commander of American Veterans with Disabilities and Chairman of band associations. With his family, Gryam relocated to Vero Beach, Florida in the 1960s, where he began working for Borden Milk as a milk salesman. In addition to selling milk, he oversaw the district's Civil Air Patrol as its commander. On certain days, he would even provide extra milk for those who couldn't afford it. He and his wife Doris raised 2 sons and a daughter. Gryam led a proud life in the city of Vero Beach, but he had no idea that it would all come to a sudden end. On Thursday, April 11, 1968, while going about his routine delivery route, Gryam was in the Gifford neighborhood when he was observed talking to a girl from the neighborhood. It was at that same moment that he was last seen alive. That day, Gryam didn't go home after work. When he did not return the truck to the Borden Milk Company's Fort Pierce office after completing his delivery route in Gifford, suspicions started to grow. After receiving an alert, the Indian River County Sheriff's Office launched a local search in the vicinity of Graham's path, but they were unable to locate him. The next day, as worries grew, a plane was scheduled for an aerial search of the city and its surrounding forests. When officers flew over a forested area between North and South Gifford roads, they saw a terrifying image. A man was found laying next to a milk truck that was spotted deep within the woods. Their greatest fears were realized when they found the scene. It was Gryam, executed with 3 shots. The shots were fired from a firearm with a low caliber, according to the autopsy report. The truck also had roughly $70 to $80 missing. Officers found out about the girl who last saw Gryam when they interviewed the residents of Gifford, where he was traveling. She claimed to have seen the milkman talking to two African-American males when she walked up to his truck. After promising the girl he would return soon, Gryam's truck picked them all up and drove off. Locals reported hearing a couple gunshots after that. A police report on the incident stated that shortly after the shots were fired, a fast-moving early 1950s Chevrolet with two unidentified male occupants were observed departing the scene. According to the girl who observed them, the two African-American men who were spotted getting into Gryam's milk truck were armed. Were they threatening Gryam for an unknown reason? Or did Gryam know them personally? How and why they were able to get into Gryam's truck is still a mystery. But neither of them could be identified. The murderers managed to avoid the authorities in spite of their greatest attempts. The sheriff's officers informed Larry Edwin Gryam, one of Gryam's kids, who was only 16 at the time, about his father's passing. Following a military farewell service, Hiram was buried in Crestlawn Cemetery on April 15, 1968. To find leads on the criminals, numerous attempts were undertaken over the course of the following 6 years, and more than 15 investigations took place around the country. However, none of the leads materialized, and sadly, the veteran soldier's murder was never solved. After 38 years, no one remembered the gruesome details of Gryam's murder. In order to stand up for his father, Larry Gryam, Gryam's son, came forward in 2006. In an open interview with a local media station, Larry Gryam and his family implicated Indian River County resident Thomas Williams as the person responsible for Hiram Gryam's death. Larry said the family had been supportive of this person's possible involvement, but the reason for this was never disclosed. This was the first time in 38 years that the case exhibited some indications of life. And seeing this, the sheriff's office decided to reopen it. However, Thomas Williams sent a letter to the newspaper's editor before the department could investigate the allegation and find out more about this person who lived in Indian River County. He said that he had no knowledge of the case and that his name had been falsely implicated in an arbitrary one. He cautioned the media not to damage his reputation, while denying any participation in this issue. This caused the investigation to lose strength and go inactive once more. Years later, in 2022, Indian River County authorities received a lead on the cold case from an unexpected source. The source of the lead was the county jail itself. An unnamed prisoner who was connected to Thomas J. Williams claimed that Williams had admitted to him about killing the milkman in the past. The prisoner informed the police that Thomas Williams was an extremely dangerous individual who had multiple arrests and convictions for various criminal charges. In order to find more witnesses to this claim, detectives looked for further Thomas Williams family members. Following their interviews with a few of them, in 2023 they located a Miami-based woman who had previously been married to Williams before their divorce. She also made the decision to remain nameless, but she was still able to give the authorities the last bit of information they required. She stated in her testimony that Williams had previously acknowledged to her that he had shot the milkman to death. Since these two witnesses had never met and were unaware of one another's statements, the investigators now had two distinct accounts. Not that the department needed much more evidence to find the accused guilty, given that Thomas Williams had passed away naturally in 2016. According to Sheriff Eric Flowers, the only reason both witnesses came forward was because Thomas Williams had passed away. Witnesses acknowledged that he was a dangerous person who posed a risk to them and their family when he was alive. In their separate testimonies to the police, both witnesses said that Williams' death had given them the confidence to come forward because at that point, he was no longer a threat.
These folks said, I would have never said anything to you before. As long as he was alive, he was a threat to me and my family. We would have never told you. But the fact that he is now dead gave them the courage to come forward. 2 independent witnesses who both say that this guy confessed to killing the milkman to them, independent of each other, don't know each other.
According to Larry, racial tensions were particularly high at the time of his father's murder because of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He believes that his father might have become a target in the Gifford neighborhood, which is primarily home to African Americans. Sheriff Flowers, however, refuted the allegations and insisted that the murderer's motivation was robbery. Following Graham's passing, the Borden Milk Corporation acknowledged that between $70 and $80 had gone missing from the vehicle. Sheriff Flowers stated that they sought confirmation from further witnesses regarding their suspicions regarding the identity of the second partner who went with Thomas Williams in the murder. He encouraged anyone with information regarding this case to get in touch with the Indian River County Sheriff's Office. Thomas J. Williams was found guilty in April of 2024 of killing Hiram Gryam. During the press briefing, Larry Gryam recalled his father's brave life and the protracted wait his family endured. After 56 years, the Gryam family at last experienced closure, and the soldier-turned-hero, Hiram Gryam, finally found peace in his resting place.
I'm very pleased that we've come to the point that we can now close the case, not necessarily the whole file, because we still have one actor that's outstanding, and hopefully we're going to close that element of it soon as well.
On June 21st, 2000, a gruesome discovery rocked the Calibri Bend Apartments in Winter Park, Florida. Cats innocently playing with a human skull. It alerted residents to a dark secret. When the police arrived, their efforts brought them to a neighboring empty lot where they discovered additional skeletal remains and personal belongings, including clothing and a shocking weapon. Investigators were at a dead end. Then, without a name or any leads, the case turned cold. Secrets buried in an empty lot had turned into a terrifying crime scene. Will they ever find out who this unfortunate soul was? And what was the chilling weapon they found at the scene? On June 21, 2000, a strange and horrific incident occurred at the Calibri Bend Apartments in Winter Park, Florida. One of the residents saw 2 cats playing with an odd object that morning. The shocking truth became apparent upon a closer look. It was a human skull. The Orange County Sheriff's Office responded right away to this concerning discovery. Detectives and deputies taped off the area so they could search it thoroughly. Then their search brought them to a deserted lot close to the flats where they found additional half-buried skeletal remains and personal belongings. Among these were clothes and the most surprising piece of evidence, a small caliber handgun, and it laid there near the corpse. Then came the most important step, forensic analysis and an autopsy. The remains were examined by forensic anthropologists. Their conclusions were unsettling. The bones belonged to a Caucasian man who was thought to be in his 40s or 60s. The remains state indicated they had been there for perhaps 7 or 8 years. What was even more unsettling was the cause of death, a gunshot wound to the head, as evidenced by the skull hole. Doctors in forensics were positive the man had been shot. The lack of victimology or the study of victim profiles hampered the inquiry despite the investigators' best efforts. The case eventually became cold for lack of identification or a clear point of entry. Not only did bones surface from an unmarked burial, but also a few important pieces of evidence like the small caliber gun. Who was he, and why was he shot? The Orange County Sheriff's Office's investigation into the remains discovered at Calibre Bend Apartments swiftly became a comprehensive examination. The detectives had a puzzle to put together with limited parts at their disposal. A small caliber gun found next to the remains provided a possible hint, but it also left more questions than answers. Who was the owner of the gun? It was an intimidating task for the forensic team who examined the objects discovered at the scene, as well as the skeletal remains with care. The location of the bones, the existence of the gun, and every article of clothing were all carefully recorded and examined. The investigation was, however, severely hindered by the time passed since death and the lack of immediate identification. No distinguishing features for the unfortunate murder victim surfaced, despite the law enforcement's efforts' best attempts. He was solely known as John Doe, and all available information about him was added to the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, NamUs, with the case number UP528. The case proved to be extremely difficult for detectives to solve because the man's identification was unknown and the investigation was a dead end. Finally, after being cold for 22 years, the case started warming up. An important turning point in the long-running mystery surrounding the John Doe case occurred in August of 2022. The Sheriff's Department of Orange County made the decision to work together with Othram, a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory situated in the Woodlands, Texas. The goal of the collaboration was to revitalize this cold case by utilizing the most recent developments in DNA technology. By creating a DNA extract from a partial subsampling of the skeletal bones found back in 2000, Othram's team made a significant advancement. With the use of their exclusive forensic-grade genome sequencing, they created an extensive DNA profile for the missing guy. This profile held the key to perhaps revealing the victim's identity, making it more than just a scientific discovery. Othram's internal genealogy team started an intense process of forensic genetic genealogy after obtaining a full DNA profile. With the use of DNA analysis, and both public and commercial genealogical databases, this technique can be used to track down family ancestors and possibly even identify the deceased person's relatives. Based on the DNA profile, the genealogist's efforts paid off as they generated fresh leads for further investigation. Law enforcement received these leads right away and launched a follow-up investigation. This was a critical stage because the detectives now had clear directions to follow, which might have led them to the unidentified man's family. In order to gather more DNA samples for critical confirmation testing, the follow-up inquiry involved reaching out to possible relatives. This sensitive stage needed to be handled with caution because it involves contacting people who might not be aware of their relationship to an old mystery. The unnamed male was finally formally identified by the investigators following extensive confirmation DNA testing. Paul Lawrence Larry Rougeux Jr. was identified as the individual to whom the skeletal remains belonged. This discovery meant more than just putting a name to rest. It was the first move towards giving a family who had probably been missing a loved one without even knowing where he was or what had happened to him some closure. On October 29, 1951, Paul Lawrence Larry Rougeux Jr. was born, known to those close to him as Larry with affection. Larry was about 40 years old when he met his tragic end. Forensic discoveries only revealed this information decades later. Larry's early life took place in a nearby area of the region off the corner of University and Goldenrod in Orange County, which is also the location where his bones were later found. His family had a 12-acre farm that included this spot. He grew up in a neighborhood he knew well throughout his childhood, where he attended Colonial High School. Known as a smooth talker, according to Orange County Homicide Detective Scott Lowen, Larry was known as a charming and outgoing individual, rather than as a dangerous guy. Still, there were complications in his life. Due to his run-ins with the police and multiple arrests, some family members speculated that he may have served time in prison. They sadly lost sight of him as a result of this assumption, leading many to believe he was imprisoned and hiding the true cause of his death. Larry disappeared in the early 1990s, and while his absence was noticed, its cause remained unknown. The lack of information and the presumption of his imprisonment complicated the family's search. There were only pictures of Larry from his high school years and from when he was a baby. However, there were no recent images to aid in a more current search. The already difficult task of determining his whereabouts or fate was made more difficult by the absence of visual documentation. Fortunately, in the year 2024, there was news of the Larry case being solved. Identifying Paul Lawrence Larry Rougeux Jr. brought long-awaited closure to his family after years of uncertainty. But the journey was far from done for the homicide investigators assigned to his investigation. Now that time had passed, the puzzle of piecing together the events leading to Larry's unexpected demise had become even more difficult. Leading detective Scott Lowen describes the difficulties they face, saying, "People die, move away, and other things happen. So it is a difficulty when you start working a case that has been going on for this long. All we're asking is for anyone who knows him to get in touch with us and provide details so we can get things going." It's evident that someone has information about Larry's friends, regular spots, or way of life, and they are encouraged to come forward. Collaboration among the community is essential. Even seemingly insignificant or disconnected information may hold the key to advancing the investigation. The Central Florida Crime Line has enabled anyone to report information anonymously by phoning 800-423-TIPS or 8477. In 1976, a strange woman appeared on the doorsteps of the St. Francis Catholic Worker House in Chicago. She had no idea of her past life and only wanted to be identified as Seven. The focus was on Chicago police and detectives who repeatedly tried to identify who Seven really was. But without any leads, a lack of identification, and due to her memory loss, the case quickly grew cold. The mystery of her identity remained unsolved even at her death in 2015. However, in 2024, nearly 50 years later, when the case was finally cracked, the police uncovered the truth that was unimaginable to believe. On a snowy day in 1976, a woman came to the doorstep of St. Francis Catholic Worker House. The first person she met was Dennis Plunkett, who saw her when she was on her way to the hospital. This woman introduced herself as Mr. Seven and insisted that she was male and should only be referred to in the third person. Other workers tried to ask Seven where she had come from, but her memory was blank. If anyone asked for her name, she would tell them Mr. Seven, or He's a number, not a name. His name is 7. Over time, she wore only men's clothes and soon became the house cook. 7 was well known for cooking spicy and sweet casseroles, as well as rice and bean dishes at the worker house, which was home to several homeless advocacy organizations. This attracted a lot of people to the place, which quickly became a top hotspot for breakfast and dinners. Still, no one knew anything about 7's past or where she had come from. She continued to stay in the worker house for more than 2 decades, staying at the White House located on a residential block. 7 stayed in the men's section, offering smoking on the porch. Her life revolved around a routine centered on cooking for the worker house until 2003, when she had suddenly passed out in the hallway. Doctors ruled the collapse as a consequence of diabetic shock, and since the Catholic worker house could not provide the type of care 7 needed, she was moved to an assisted care facility in Chicago. 7 became a ward of the state until her death on November 18, 2015, as a result of heart disease along with dementia and persistent diabetes that contributed to her failing health. This was nearly 40 years after her first appearance at the Catholic worker house in Chicago in the 1970s. Investigators, puzzled about her anonymity, had taken fingerprint records from her, but they didn't match to any database. Lost for what to do, they buried 7 at the Mount Olivet Catholic Cemetery. She was buried at the section for unidentified people with her tombstone only showing the numbers 04985 written on it. This number marked the amount of deaths that had taken place in Chicago, 2015, with 7 being the 4,985th case. The police first took an interest in 7 after her arrival at a care facility along Lake Michigan in 2015. Since she didn't have a legal name or any means of identification, they quickly filed a missing persons report, documenting her memory loss and disorientation. Police also tried to take her fingerprints twice, but it was unsuccessful due to disfigured fingers causing unreadable prints. Afterwards, they circulated a photo of her to other Illinois law enforcement agencies. Sometime later, the public brought up a person named Skevin, who had died in a car accident, but this was quickly proved to be a false alarm. The physical description of 7 noted her to be light in complexion, with blue eyes and short hair, having very few teeth. Still, nothing was found about 7, not even a social security number, and so the investigation was eventually suspended. The only information the police had, aside from her history at the St. Patrick's Catholic worker house, was that she was a Cubs fan and had childhood memories of visiting the Indiana Dunes. In 2022, Cook County investigators took over 7's case, with the aim of identifying the woman who had helped the St. Francis Catholic Church for so long. Sheriff Tom Dart, whose office had gained popularity for the solving of cold case crimes, described 7's case as unusual. It was weird for a person to remain unidentified, both in life and after death as well. The investigators had long ruled out foul play as the cause for her sudden appearance, so they matched her previously collected fingerprint sample and ran it across multiple DNA databases, including the ones of criminal records. There was no match on that database, so as a last resort, they ran it through the military data. Luckily, there was a match on August 4th, 2023. After 4 decades of only knowing this woman as 7 Doe, she could finally be identified with a real name. The data from the fingerprints obtained from 7's body matched a record in the military database. The match was a woman named Reba Caroline Bailey, who had been enlisted in the Army in 1961. Using this name, investigators in 2024 were able to find the surviving members of her family and piece together a few aspects of her life. Reba C. Bailey was born in 1940 in Danville, Illinois, about 225 kilometers south of Chicago. She had a stay-at-home mother, Edna Bailey, and a carpenter father who often traveled for work, so there were multiple addresses for their large family in Illinois and Alabama. Reba was the youngest of 6 children, including 2 who died before adulthood. In 1950, when she was 10 years old, her family was involved in an accident when her father stopped their car to pick up a suitcase he saw at the side of the highway. They were hit by another car, which caused a fatal accident that took the life of Reba's mother. Reba, her father, and brother were also terribly injured. Over the years, she worked as an elevator operator at a club and as a sales clerk. According to records, she enjoyed swimming, bowling, golf, and photography. However, there were no records of her in any public or private Catholic schools in Danville, nor were there any photos of her in high school yearbooks. In 1960, Reba enlisted for the Army and joined the military. She served the country in the home of chemical weapons, Fort McClellan in Alabama, Fort Ord in California, and in Texas as well. Along the line of service, she was awarded a medal for good conduct. 2 years later, in 1962, at the age of 21, she got married to a fellow veteran, 22-year-old John H. Bilberry in California. She was honorably discharged due to her marriage some weeks later. However, no one could tell what happened between the period of her discharge from the military to ending up in Chicago with no recollection of her name or life before. When police reached out to Reba's family, they found out that her husband had passed away in 1989 while serving in Vietnam. He had remarried 14 years after Reba's disappearance, but the wife and 2 of his siblings had already passed away. Reba's father and all her siblings had passed away as well, with her sister who died in 2007 being the most recent. However, she had more than half a dozen nieces and nephews living in Florida, Alabama, and Illinois, who had heard of her but never got the chance to meet her. Among them was 65-year-old Ricky Bailey, a funeral home director and the son of Reba's older brother Richard, who died in 2000. In shock, he told police how his father had been looking for Reba for decades. Rick also said that he believed his father and Reba's other siblings would be very excited to hear that their sister had finally been found, supposing they were still alive. Rick further told police how over the years their family had different stories as to what caused Reba's disappearance. According to him, some said there was a huge fight between Reba and her father shortly before she disappeared. Others said it was about her decision to rejoin the military. Still, some believed it was because of her unwelcomed sexual orientation. Among all of these, no one could understand why Reba wanted to be referred to as a male or why she named herself Seven, and the people who could have known had already passed away. Investigators assumed that maybe the name Seven was related to military service or birth order. Although Reba was the youngest child of her family, relatives had found some evidence that there might have been an unnamed child before Reba was born. However, nothing concrete could be proven, but if this was true, then Reba would have been child number 7. The only thing Rick and his other cousins knew was that there had been stories of Reba visiting family in Arizona and Chicago with her husband. Some of them told the police they remembered Reba's siblings talking about how she had started using alcohol and drugs, as well as dressed like a man. Amanda Ingram, Reba's great-niece, took up searching for Reba Bailey when her uncle Richard Bailey died in 2001. As a family historian, she kept up a family tree with records on a family website. She showed the police photos of Reba wearing a black button-down with her salt and pepper hair. Ingram expressed her pleasure towards everything that had happened, knowing her grand aunt was well taken care of. For a while, Reba's family members considered moving her body closer to them in Illinois, but they ultimately decided against it, due to the expenses and complications involved. "We decided as a family not to disturb her," Rick Bailey said. "At least we know where she is now." Family and friends were shocked when they discovered who Seven was all this time. Sam Guardino, a former house resident staying near Seven at the time, said he had accepted Seven for who she was and figured she would tell her story when she wanted to. Still, nobody could have done more to help the homeless, 83-year-old Plunkett said about Seven's good works at the Catholic Worker House. "Even though I suspected she had mental problems and tried to help, she often refused." The commander of the Missing Persons Unit, Jason Moran, said it was good for everyone to have a name. A person dying without knowing who they were wasn't a good occurrence. The Cook County investigators have planned for a new tombstone for Reba, as well as a round of military honors to be conducted for her. In addition to this, the sheriff's office in Illinois had started making plans to pass a new law that allowed post-mortem fingerprints to be checked across all DNA databases from the state and federal sections. This was reviewed in order to make identification of missing persons easier. It is beyond shocking how a woman full of life could suddenly go missing one day and be found with no memory of who she was. With all the varying stories, one can't help but wonder what really happened to Reba Caroline Bailey. Was she in an accident? Did she have children? What were her reasons for choosing to be addressed as a man? Had the signs of dementia started long before it was actually diagnosed? Sadly, she is no longer alive to tell her story and see the family she left behind while living a totally different life. However, her case will bring more light into the post-mortem identification of unknown persons. On February 10, 2009, the residents of Ridgewood, Queens, New York were going about their usual daily activities when their afternoon took a sinister turn. A 64-year-old man named Rosario Prestigiacomo was found viciously stabbed to death, with his blood plastered all over his home's walls. The detectives at the scene were left with numerous unanswered questions, not realizing how long the investigation would stretch. After 15 years of tireless investigation, the detectives finally cracked the case with the help of advanced forensic genealogy and an unexpectedly crucial piece of evidence: a used fork. Around 2:15 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the New York Police Department received a distress call from Ridgewood, a neighborhood in Queens, New York. The 911 call came from a concerned neighbor who had been hearing unusual noises from a nearby house all afternoon. The neighbor described the sounds as resembling a struggle between two people and urged the authorities to investigate. It didn't take long for the police officer to arrive at the described two-story house located at 2031 Green Avenue Street in Ridgewood. The officer had repeatedly called out to the resident to let him in, but there was still no response, so he decided to go in himself by accessing the house through the first-floor window. Once the officer entered the house, he was greeted with a horrific scene. A deceased man was found lying face down in a pool of his own blood. The initial investigations showed that he had been viciously stabbed about 16 times in the neck, torso, face, and limbs. The attack was so gruesome that the man's blood was splattered all over the walls of his home, making the residence look like a bloody butcher's shop. An alarming amount of blood was also present in the hallway, and the forensics team was immediately called to analyze the ghastly crime scene and gather evidence. After the secure perimeter had been set up and access to the property restricted to only the authorized personnel, the entire crime scene was documented with accurate sketches and photographs. Both the sketches and photographs taken by forensics captured the exact position of the victim's body was found, the numerous blood splatters both on and around the corpse, along with other potentially incriminating evidence found throughout the house. When the documentation of the crime scene had been completed, the forensic team began to gather and collect evidence. Unsurprisingly, the majority of the evidence they were able to acquire were blood samples. In addition to the blood samples, they collected blood swabs from the hallway, cloth fibers, hairs, and fingerprints from all locations in the house. They also retrieved the fingernails of the victim and any potential weapons they could find in the vicinity. The forensic team soon finished the evidence collection, and the only thing left was to carefully study the corpse before sending the victim's body over to the medical examiner. During their examination, forensics found that in addition to the clear stab wounds recorded by the first responders at the scene, there was also extreme damage to the victim's chest, esophagus, lungs, and abdomen, all marked with visceral puncture wounds. A detailed report from both the first responders and the forensic team was sent over to the chief medical examiner, who confirmed most of their findings. However, he uncovered something new during his extensive examinations. He had noticed several blunt force injuries on the victim's head and torso, which appeared to have been inflicted with a shovel. This detail coincided with one of the probable weapons gathered as evidence by the forensics team. While the detectives didn't find the knife or dagger they believed was the murder weapon, one of the potential weapons used during the attack that was retrieved at the crime scene was a bloody shovel. The presence of these blunt force traumas also indicated a struggle had taken place before the attacker stabbed him to death. A further analysis by the chief medical examiner revealed even more incriminating evidence, mainly found in the blood samples. They would give the detectives the first trace of their escaped killer. The chief medical examiner had created DNA profiles from the blood samples retrieved by the forensics team and the crime scene detectives during his examination. While examining the DNA obtained from the blood swabs, he noticed that apart from the DNA of the victim, there existed the DNA of an unknown male. After a few more tests, the medical examiner was convinced that the foreign DNA profile belonged to the killer. Additional analysis also showed that some of the blood samples with the foreign DNA were retrieved from under the victim's fingernails. This led the chief medical examiner to theorize that the unidentified DNA might have gotten there when the victim scratched or injured his assailant while attempting to escape, avoid the barrage of attacks, and fight back. The detective's initial approach to identifying the DNA sample was to put the unidentified sample into the local police DNA database and cross-check the profile with any suitable matches. It really seemed like the detectives had already solved the case at this point, as all they needed to do now was to wait for the DNA profile to be identified by the database. Unfortunately for the detectives, this was where the first major challenge popped up in their investigation, as no matches were found for the unidentified DNA. Despite the initial setback, the detectives weren't willing to give up that easily. Over the course of the investigation, the unidentified DNA profile was placed into several other local, state, and even national DNA databases and databanks. But no matter how many times they tried, or how many DNA databases they used, the detectives weren't able to identify the foreign DNA. And it wasn't long before it started to look like the victim's cold-blooded killer didn't even exist. To speed up the identification process of the elusive killer, the detectives went to interrogate and question the victim's neighbors to see what they knew about him and if they'd seen anything that night. One particular neighbor, whose name was Sam Shaham, told the detectives that he had met Prestigiacomo on numerous occasions as he used to frequent the deli he owned, located at the corner of Green and Grandview Avenues. During his interview, Shaham further described Prestigiacomo as an elderly Italian landlord who was very quiet and didn't talk much. He then said that their block on Green Avenue, Ridgewood, was also quiet, and they never heard or witnessed any bizarre noises coming from his home until that Tuesday afternoon. A woman who referred to herself as Mama Teresa told the detectives that she was one of the oldest residents in Ridgewood, and she had been living in the neighborhood for over 54 years. She told the detectives that while they weren't common, she had seen some violent acts over the years, recalling an incident when another man who lived in the neighborhood was stabbed for his necklace. However, when she was asked by the detectives if she had ever witnessed any violent acts that happened around Prestigiacomo in the past, she said no. She further described him in the same way Shaham did, saying Prestigiacomo was a calm person who kept to himself. There was also no evidence that he had been involved in any violent or strange acts while he had been living in the neighborhood. After they had finished questioning all of Prestigiacomo's neighbors, the detectives didn't get anything on the killer, as no one could identify his assailant. With the detectives still having no solid leads on the identification of the foreign DNA, they decided to use a different tactic and look into the background of the victim, hoping they could potentially find some leads that would help them finally solve the case. The detectives had already identified the victim as Mr. Rosario Prestigiacomo. He was a 64-year-old man who was known to be a very reserved and quiet individual. The detectives had also spoken to all of his neighbors in Ridgewood, Queens, and each of them described him as a private but very friendly individual. The detectives then decided to look for clues elsewhere in his past as they tried to build a timeline leading to his murder. During their investigations, they found out that Prestigiacomo, who had been divorced from his ex-wife, had been living alone during the latter years of his life. Not much was uncovered about his career, apart from Shaham's information that he was a landlord. However, due to the fact that he had been a long-time resident of the neighborhood, the investigators believed he might have already retired or was working locally. The last thing the investigators uncovered about the victim was that despite Prestigiacomo's reserved nature, he was still a well-known and well-respected figure in his local community. He was liked by all his neighbors, and none of them had anything bad or negative to say about him. All this information made the investigation even more challenging for the detectives, as they racked their brains trying to figure out who would want to ruthlessly murder a well-respected and polite 64-year-old man in a quiet neighborhood. It proved impossible for the detectives to answer these questions as time went by. Everything they uncovered in his background kept leading them to dead ends. And despite their redoubled efforts, no government databases could identify him through his DNA profile. The NYPD detectives continued to try everything they could to solve the case. But at the rate the investigation was going, it slowly started to look like their burning questions on the killer's identity and his motive would never be answered. As the months continued to pass by, the efforts put into solving the ghastly murder case of Rosario Prestigiacomo slowly dwindled. A solution to the case seemed completely impossible at this point, and the numerous detectives and officers who had tirelessly worked on the murder case were pulled and assigned other cases. It wasn't long after that before the folder on the horrific homicide grew cold, with no answers to give to his grieving family. About 13 long years had passed since the homicide case of Rosario Prestigiacomo had gone cold. However, while the case had grown even colder over the years, it had never been forgotten. In March of 2022, both the detectives from the Cold Case Squad and the Queens District Attorney's Office decided to follow up on the case using an entirely different approach than what was used by the detectives in 2009. Their new approach saw them using a bit of outside help to follow up and potentially solve the case, and the detectives found that help in a private laboratory called Othram. Othram was a private and pioneering laboratory located in Woodlands, Texas, in the United States. They specialized in forensic genetic genealogy and the application of advanced forensic DNA technology to identify human remains and solve cold cases. The detectives also reached out to the United States Department of Homeland Security and asked them to help generate leads that could help identify the unknown suspect using forensic genetic genealogy. Both the Department of Homeland Security and Othram assisted the Cold Case Squad, and due to their joint assistance, the detectives were able to get a viable lead that could finally reveal the identity of the killer, who had managed to continuously escape their grasp for all these years. DNA technology had advanced rapidly over the years since Prestigiacomo's homicide case had grown cold. The advancements in forensic genetic genealogy allowed the specialists at Othram Inc. to create a comprehensive genealogical profile from the blood samples that were retrieved from the crime scene, using advanced DNA testing on the unidentified DNA sample in June of 2022. Once the tests were over, the specialists at Othram uploaded the genealogical profile to public databases, and this was what the NYPD Cold Case Squad needed to finally move on to the next phase of the investigation. Investigator Linda Doyle, who was part of the NYPD's Forensic Investigations Division, built a family tree to identify any possible suspects or the relatives of a potential suspect using information from the now updated databases. It took her a while, but in December of 2023, Investigator Doyle handed over a lead to the NYPD and the District Attorney's Office. Working alongside each other, Detectives Francis Noonan and Matthew DeBonis of the NYPD's Cold Case Squad, who were working under the supervision of Sergeant James Wheeler, joined forces with the detectives from the District Attorney's Office. They tirelessly chased down the lead they had been given, and after extensive investigations and detective work, They finally put a face to the unidentified DNA profile. The man they believed was their prime suspect was named Anthony Scalici. A thorough investigation was carried out into the man Anthony Scalici, and it was revealed that the 41-year-old man was the nephew of Rosario Prestigiacomo. He was the son of Prestigiacomo's ex-wife's brother, a revelation that had baffled the entire NYPD department. The detectives quickly tracked him down to Boynton Beach, Florida. However, even after finding his current whereabouts, they still needed indisputable proof, and the only way they could get that was by acquiring some of Anthony Scalici's DNA. Detectives Marco Viari and Aramis Gregorian of the Detective Bureau were assigned a surveillance operation that occurred on various days throughout the months of January and February of 2024. They were assisted by the Boynton Beach Police Department, which were working under the supervision of Sergeant Corey Henry, in addition to the United States Department of Homeland Security. The detectives carefully followed Anthony Scalici's movements through the surveillance operation, and on February 17, 2024, they managed to successfully acquire a used fork that Anthony Scalici had discarded. Anthony Scalici's fork was analyzed by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner under the supervision of Lisa Mertz, who was the Assistant Director of the NYPD Cold Case Squad. After the analysis, the medical examiner was able to produce a DNA profile. This profile was sent for DNA testing, and it perfectly matched the unknown DNA profile that was found under Prestigiacomo's fingernail and in various other retrieved blood samples that were left at the gruesome crime scene. With no doubts left in their minds, the NYPD's Regional Fugitive Task Force, with assistance from the United States Marshals and the Boynton Beach Police Department, arrested 41-year-old Anthony Scalici on May 14, 2024.
New DNA enhancements led them to Anthony Scalici, who was arrested in Florida. He is identified as the suspect's nephew through marriage.
Scalici was then extradited to New York to face charges on May 29, 2024. Anthony Scalici was arraigned on May 30, 2024 in the Queens Supreme Court. He was charged with second-degree murder for the killing of his 64-year-old uncle, Rosario Prestigiacomo. Scalici's lawyer, attorney David Cohen, told the court that his client had pleaded not guilty that Thursday morning. The prosecutor for the case was Assistant District Attorney Karen L. Ross, who is the chief of the Cold Case Unit and Deputy Bureau Chief of the Homicide Bureau as of 2024. Attorney Ross is being assisted by Assistant District Attorney Veronica Protopregora. Justice Kenneth Holder, who presided over Anthony Scalici's arraignment on May 30, 2024, has scheduled his next court appearance for July 8, 2024. Anthony Scalici is being held in jail at Rikers Island until July 8th and faces up to 25 years to life in prison if he is convicted. Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz, who was present during Scalici's arraignment, gave a statement to the press on the case saying, "I formed a cold case unit to bring closure to grieving families and seek justice on behalf of victims. This case is an example of the perseverance and determination of the investigators on this and every cold case and highlights the successful partnership formed between my office and the NYPD Cold Case Squad. Defendants should not be able to evade justice no matter how much time has passed." The identification of Rosario Prestigiacomo's killer has brought much-needed closure to Prestigiacomo's family. The victim's daughter, Rosa Adele, gave a statement to the press on her father's homicide case, saying, "It's a real big shock. All this time he was right beneath us, and we didn't know it. Nobody had the right to kill my father. What Scalici did was disgusting. He should live a life of torment. I can't forget it. I can't. It's a bad dream, and we want to wake up and have my dad back." The victim's brother, Vincenzo Prestigiacomo, also spoke to the press in a short video interview, expressing his thanks and gratitude to the investigators who relentlessly worked to bring his brother to justice.
Please do a good job. My father, nice man. Okay, thank you very much.
While the investigators were never able to find a motive behind Prestigiacomo's tragic and terrifying murder, His family is still thankful that solving his murder has brought some relief to the emotional toll they have been bearing all these years. They also hope that this resolution will bring some closure. In the aftermath of the trial, the homicide case of Rosario Prestigiacomo has had a significant impact on law enforcement and how future cases are solved. The identification of Prestigiacomo's murderer marks the first use of forensic genetic genealogy to identify a suspect in a New York City homicide, and the detectives know it was only thanks to the use of that technology that the 15-year-long cold case was finally solved in 2024. On August 8, 2000, in Beckley, West Virginia, a quiet day turned into a chilling mystery. Natasha Alex Carter, a young girl full of life, and her mother Susan Carter, age 41, disappeared suddenly. There were no hints, no clues, just an unsettling void where they once were. Susan's life with her new husband, Larry Webb, added another layer of complexity to her disappearance. How could a mother and daughter vanish without a trace from the safety of their own home? Was someone they trusted responsible for their disappearance? For Rick Lafferty, Alex's father, it was as if he had suddenly woken up to find his daughter gone, as if she had never existed. She didn't call him or get in touch with him. Days passed, then weeks, and then months. But the search for Alex and Susan brought no answers. They seemed to have vanished completely, leaving no clues behind.
24 years. And this case went cold so many times that, I almost lost hope several times. But I can tell anybody that's in my position, just never give up hope of finding your child.
Rick strongly believed he knew who was responsible for his family's disappearance, but he struggled to convince the authorities to take him seriously. However, sometimes all it takes is one person in the right place to change everything. And Rick didn't give up until he found that person, FBI Special Agent Jennifer King. When the United States Marshal Service brought the missing case to the FBI's attention, Rick felt nobody else would listen to him, except for Agent King. It was Agent King who then decided she wouldn't rest until Alex was found. With the help of other law enforcement personnel, she brought new energy to the case, reigniting hope in finding out what had happened to Alex. In the initial stages of her disappearance, people suspected her mother might have taken her and left West Virginia. Because Susan had a rough relationship with Rick and she moved in with Webb at his residence in Beckley. At the time, there was an ongoing custody dispute between Susan and Rick. The FBI's document revealed Susan had told Rick during their custody dispute that he'd never see his daughter again. They also warned the public that Susan might change her appearance and use the alias Susan Galley Carter Webb. Alex's grandmother Shirley Day also remembered Alex saying she was afraid of her mother and didn't want to live with her.
I told her, I said, I wish things was different for you. And she said, well, my mom, she said, it's all right.
She vividly recalled Alex's testimony in court during the custody battle, where Alex expressed her fears. Rick believed Alex disappeared months before the official missing date listed on posters. He also claimed that Susan didn't show up for the next court hearing, which led to him being granted full custody. But by then, it might have been too late. Even though the poster said Alex was last seen on August 8, 2000, Rick believed she went missing months earlier, soon after Susan's clear warning that he would never see Alex again. The FBI offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to a resolution in the case. Law enforcement officials suspected Susan abducted Alex, and a felony warrant for kidnapping was issued for Susan on November 13, 2000. At an FBI press conference, Rick tearfully pleaded for his daughter's return, expressing his longing to have her back home, no matter the circumstances. 20 years passed since Alex and Susan disappeared, and age progression photos created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children depicted what Alex and Susan might look like in 2021. Rick suspected Susan's new husband, Larry Webb, might be responsible for Alex's disappearance. The FBI shared this suspicion and executed 2 search warrants at Webb's home. And that's when they made a chilling discovery. During an August 2023 search, officers found a bullet lodged in a remodeled bedroom wall, along with traces of blood. Forensic testing confirmed that the DNA on the bullet matched Alex's, leading to an unsettling realization of the violence that might have occurred. Caregiver Terry Lilly, who looked after Webb, recounted the searches that led to this shocking discovery, emphasizing the significance of the evidence found behind the bedroom wall.
They had taken a section of wall out in the time before and came back months later and said that after DNA testing, they had found a bullet in the wall and blood that had dripped down into the base of the wall. DNA testing shows they related have belonged to the girl.
Now DNA testing confirmed that all the collected evidence belonged to the missing girl. Sadly, just days after that interview, Terry passed away. However, investigators also gathered witness statements, further contributing to the mounting evidence against Webb. When asked about the additional evidence leading to the indictment in 2023, authorities were cautious due to the ongoing nature of the investigation. They mentioned DNA evidence and witness statements, but refrained from diverging specific details at that point. One neighbor, whose name wasn't disclosed, had moved to Kyle Lane in 1999 and claimed to have seen a young girl at Webb's house during the summer of 2000. Although he only saw her once, he became suspicious when he noticed a missing child poster in the neighborhood a year later. In 2021, upon learning about the investigation into missing persons, he believed the child he saw was Alex Carter. The neighbor also recalled seeing another woman at Webb's house shortly after Susan and Alex disappeared. This newfound statement was a breakthrough for detectives, redirecting their focus squarely onto Webb for a confession regarding the fate of Alex and her mother. Webb, now elderly, reportedly had dementia, which he allegedly used to his advantage. According to Webb and his caregiver, his memory was failing and he claimed not to remember anything about the disappearance of the mother and daughter. Despite being romantically involved with Susan, he professed love for both her and Alex, strongly denying any involvement in their disappearance. He insisted that he had searched for them over the years and recalled being on a trip when they went missing. However, he believed he had contacted the police in Charleston and Beckley and had undergone a polygraph test in the aftermath, but the results never seemed doubtful.
I don't know. I swear I don't know. I don't have any idea what happened to her.
Webb's caregiver cautioned that his memory was unreliable due to the dementia, suggesting that his recollection of events might be flawed. And Webb kept asserting that he loved Susan and Alex deeply, expressing remorse for not being able to find them despite his efforts. Despite his efforts to proclaim his innocence, suspicions continued to mount against Webb. Authorities closely investigated his every word and action in the hope of uncovering the truth. As the investigation drew closer to the truth, the FBI decided to increase the reward for information, raising it from $10,000 to $20,000. However, some wondered if this gesture was too little or too late. And so state police made a significant announcement, declaring that Susan was no longer suspected of kidnapping Alex. Tony Rauza of the FBI admitted that mistakes had been made in the investigation at the outset, and that they were looking into it. Meanwhile, Rick expressed his frustration towards the responsibility of Wyoming County Sheriff's Departments in this case. He believed that if they had taken his concerns seriously from the beginning, Alex would have still been alive today.
If the Wyoming County Sheriff's Department had listened to me from the get-go, from the start, from the very beginning, this case would have been solved and perhaps Alex would have been alive today, but they refused to even write the warrant and refused to even investigate, the disappearance, telling me that they weren't missing, that Alex was with her mother. And I said, well, where's her mother? And the sheriff told me, he said, well, I don't know where her mother is. To me, that's the very definition of missing, is if you don't know where someone is.
Despite his pleas, they initially dismissed Alex's disappearance, insisting she was with her mother. Nevertheless, with Susan being declared not a suspect in the kidnapping case, after 23 long years, the case had finally reached a critical point. Now the focus shifted to finding the bodies of Alex and Susan. In October of 2023, 2 months after the last search warrant, it was determined that Alex had been murdered in her room at Webb's Kyle Lane home. Webb, now in his 80s, was indicted on October 24, 2023, with murder charges for the disappearance of Susan and Alex Carter. Ben Hatfield, the Raleigh County prosecuting attorney, expressed confidence in the case against Webb. Despite Webb's declining health and the legal challenges involved in his arrest, Hatfield was determined to pursue justice for Alex and Susan. Due to Webb's deteriorating health and the legal hurdles associated with obtaining medical clearance for his arrest was delayed until April of 2024. The grand jury was presented with the evidence, and an indictment was requested. The delays continued for a while, despite efforts to expedite the process, including visits to nursing homes where Webb stayed. However, it was during one of these visits that a breakthrough in the case occurred. On April 24, 2024, Special Investigator Jeff Schote and retired Chief of Detectives from Beckley City Police Department visited the Hilltop Nursing Home, where Webb was residing before a court date. During their conversation, Webb gave a detailed confession. He admitted to shooting Susan Carter after suspecting her of taking cash from his home. The argument that followed led to her death. Webb then confessed to shooting Alex for eliminating the sole witness. According to Webb's confession, he stored the bodies in the basement of his home overnight, before burying them in a shallow grave in the woods on his property over the next 2 nights. He buried them together, clad in their clothes. Webb's confession provided closure to a case that had haunted investigators and the community for over 2 decades. Despite the challenges faced along the way, the relentless pursuit of justice ultimately prevailed. The confession served as a crucial piece of evidence, shedding light on the events that led to the untimely deaths of Susan and Alex Carter, and bringing some piece of closure to their grieving loved ones, especially Rick, who had been waiting to know what happened to his daughter for nearly 2 long decades. Finally, the confession has been provided. Law enforcement officers were determined to bring little Alex back to her father and find closure for the grieving family. However, Webb's deteriorating health and memory hindered the search efforts. Despite his attempts to guide them to the burial site, Webb was unable to provide an exact location. In a display of unwavering commitment, neighbors Grant and Tammy Newhouse, owners of New Horizons Landscaping, volunteered their time and equipment to assist with the excavation.
We need to know if you will be willing to excavate today, right now. And so we talked, I said, sure. So we put 2 of our best guys, Ty Walker and Josh Poe, who are best excavator operators on it, and within 45 minutes we were digging.
They tirelessly combed through Webb's backyard, row by row, until their efforts were rewarded. And on April 11th, 2024, after 2 days of exhaustive searching, the bodies of Alex and Susan Carter were finally discovered.
And then Jennifer yelled, "We got them. We found them." He texted me immediately and said, "We found them." And there wasn't a dry eye on this property.
The moment was bittersweet, with the end of a 24-year-long search for closure. Tragically, just hours before the discovery, Webb passed away in prison, escaping the full consequences of his heinous actions. Webb, who was incarcerated at Mount Olive, West Virginia, suffered what police are calling a medical episode. Webb was later pronounced dead at Montgomery General Hospital. According to a press release provided by Captain R.A. Maddy with the West Virginia State Police, Webb's medical emergency began at approximately 10:30 in the morning of April 11, 2024, just a few hours after the remains were found in his backyard. For Rick, Alex's father, the discovery brought a mixture of emotions: relief that his daughter had been found, yet profound sadness at the circumstances of her death.
She liked to be carried, so I carried her. My mom said, "You gonna carry her when her feet hit the ground, you know?" I said, "Well, yeah, if she wants me to, I will."
His unwavering belief that one day she would come home had finally been realized, albeit in the most devastating way possible. As the case comes to a close, there is a glimmer of hope that the Carters can find some semblance of peace, knowing that Alex and her mother can finally be laid to rest. Intelligent, attractive, and popular, 23-year-old Tara Louise Baker was a much-admired student at the University of Georgia Law School. But on January 19, 2001, just one day before her 24th birthday, Tara was discovered dead in the bedroom of her off-campus apartment at Athens, Georgia, while her house went up in flames. Detectives quickly ruled it as arson, and evidence indicated she had died hours before the fire began. Friends said they left her at the library the previous night. So what happened between that time and mid-morning the next day? Despite a detailed investigation, there were no leads, no clues, and no suspects. The case grew cold, even as students on the campus lived in fear of an unknown killer roaming free. Nearly 2.5 decades later, in 2024, detectives were finally able to piece the clues together and make an arrest. Who killed Tara Baker? Why did they do it? Will the forever 23-year-old finally get justice? Tara Louise Baker, fondly called Tara by family and friends, was born on January 20th, 1977, to parents Virginia and Lindsay Baker. She was from East Point in Fulton County, Georgia. She was the eldest child in the family and had 2 brothers, Adam and Kevin, as well as a sister, Meredith. After graduating Lovejoy High School in 1995, she went on to attend Georgia College in Milledgeville, where she graduated cum laude in 1998 with 2 bachelor's degrees in political science and paralegal studies. Tara was part of the Alpha Delta Pi sorority while in college and had interned with Forest Park attorney Jack Hancock. With big dreams of becoming a prosecutor or a judge, Tara moved to Athens in 1999 after getting accepted to study law at the University of Georgia. She also worked part-time in a local law firm called Fortson & Bentley. At school, Tara was known for trying to make the university experience better for everyone. She was quick to offer help, so no one felt left behind in class projects or study groups. To her family and friends, she was an adoring person who was truly dedicated to ensuring justice and fairness in the world. And so her tragic fate, mired in injustice and unfairness, came as an unbearable blow to her loved ones. In the early hours of January 19, 2001, the people of Athens, Clark County, woke up to a fire in the house located at 160 Fawn Drive in the Deer Park subdivision off Lexington Road. Neighbors quickly called 911, but by the time firefighters arrived at 11:20 a.m., heavy smoke and flames were billowing out of the apartment. After kicking in the front door and entering the building, the first thing the firefighters noticed was that all 4 burners in the kitchen were turned on. The bedroom door was locked, but they managed to open it only to see a room absolutely gutted by the fire. They worked quickly to put out the flames, but by then it was too late. First-year law student at the University of Georgia, Tara Louise Baker, was lying dead on the bedroom floor of her off-campus home. Her body nearly mutilated by the fire exactly 1 day before her 24th birthday. Detectives and police came afterwards to investigate, cordoning off the home as a crime scene. They revealed that the fire was a deliberate act of arson intended to end Tara's life and destroy critical evidence. Her distraught friends told police they had last seen her the previous night at the UGA Law School library around 7:30 p.m. They had left before her at around 9:46 p.m. She had called to ensure they got back home safely. Tara herself planned to leave the library around 10 p.m., and that was the last time they had heard from her. So what happened? From the autopsy conducted on Tara's body, it was discovered that she was killed between 9:45 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. on January 18, 2001, long before the fire had begun. According to the coroner, Tara had struggled and put up a fight before her death. It was further revealed that she had been strangled and stabbed in the neck with a knife with a 3-inch long blade, after which she was struck in the head with a blunt object. There were no signs of forced entry in her home, and as there was only a laptop computer missing, police ruled out burglary as a motive. Additional investigations revealed that Tara had been assaulted, which probably explained why the attacker had tried to hide her body by setting her house on fire. An open window in the kitchen led police to believe the murderer had escaped that way. Because of the extent of the fire, detectives were unable to gather much evidence from the scene that hadn't already been burned off or heavily damaged. However, her boyfriend of several years, Chris, was initially considered a suspect, especially due to the injuries at the back of his hands. He maintained he had punched a wall out of grief and was eventually cleared after his alibi checked out and he passed a polygraph test. Still, friends of Tara held opposing beliefs about her relationship with Chris. Some felt their relationship had issues, while others maintained they were serious and had talked about marriage and family. Tara's housemates, who were both out of town at the time of the attack and arson, were also interviewed, but their statements checked out. There was also a classmate who was rumored to be in love with Tara, but his affection wasn't reciprocated as Tara saw him as a creep. A report of a bloodstain on this classmate's book led to a search of his apartment, but nothing incriminating was found. Other classmates were interviewed, but they were also cleared. People reported having seen a black male standing near the driveway of Tara's home on the day of the fire. He did not appear to live in the area, and police suspected he was a locally known criminal. But the lead went nowhere. Someone also described seeing a white male dressed in a t-shirt and jeans running from Tara's backyard at around 7 a.m. that fateful morning, but could offer no more descriptions. Neighbors and friends couldn't picture anyone who held a grudge against Tara. She was loved by everyone on campus and at home. As months passed without progress, students at the campus started to grow weary and impatient. But it was her family that struggled the most to cope with their sudden loss. They spent the next holiday season without her, and were heartbroken at the lack of new developments in the murder case. A memorial was organized by some of the students at the University of Georgia, where they finally remembered her and talked about what she had done for them. 2 decades later, in 2021, creator and host Cameron J. developed a very detailed podcast to discuss Tara's murder. The entire Baker family, especially her mother, sisters, and brothers, were grateful for the renewed attention to her case, especially as the police had failed to give them updates over the years. They actively participated in the podcast, answering questions and begging the public for answers. This new attention provided a lot of new tips and information, and a $27,000 reward was offered to anyone who had substantial leads on the case. But the continued lack of evidence, plus the lack of worthwhile suspects and motive, quickly caused the case to grow cold again. Until 2023. On May 9, 2024, the Athens-Clarke County Police Department, ACCPD, and the Cold Case Unit at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, made a surprise joint announcement. Someone had been arrested for Tara's murder. The new Cold Case Unit was established under the Georgia Coleman-Baker Act, passed in 2023.
For the families of 2 young women killed decades ago, both families telling me that this new law not only adds to their loved one's legacy, but it will help countless other families.
It is made up of experienced special agents who have demonstrated proficiency in solving complex death investigations through the use of forensic science, case file analysis, and cutthroat technology. The Coleman-Baker Act was named to honor Tara Louise Baker and 18-year-old high school student Rhonda Sue Coleman, who was killed in Jeff Davis County, Georgia in 1990. This same act brought about the laws and reviews that eventually helped solve Tara's murder. According to officials, the Cold Case Unit and the ACCPD partnered up in September of 2023 to review the biological evidence left behind in the crime scene. They additionally used DNA science and new technology to generate leads, eventually unmasking the killer. So who was Tara's ruthless attacker? Edric Lamont Faust, a 48-year-old man residing in Athens, Georgia, was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including murder, arson, tampering of evidence, aggravated sodomy, and assault in connection to Tara's death. There were no prior connections between Faust and Tara, so the police couldn't identify any specific or personal reason behind the murder. Faust has had lots of arrests in Athens, Clarke County. According to records, he was arrested barely a month after Tara's murder for cutting someone's neck during an aggravated assault.
Dozens of arrests documented in Athens, Clarke County. According to court records, less than a month after Tara was killed in 2001, Faust was arrested and pleaded guilty to aggravated assault for cutting someone's neck. Faust's arrest comes just months after the GBI partnered with Athens, Clarke County Police to review Tara's case in September of last year.
He has also been incarcerated a number of times, with the latest sentence spanning from May of 2001 to May of 2003. He has an unsettling history of arrests and probation violations, including charges of simple battery, disorderly conduct, and criminal trespass. At the time of his arrest in the Athens-Clarke County Jail, Faust was placed on a bond of $15,000 while awaiting an attorney to defend his case. After 2.5 decades, Tara's killer has finally been caught, providing relief to everyone who knew and loved her. Tara Louise Baker was a hardworking student with a bright future ahead of her. Chris Hosey, the director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, said her life was stolen from her in a horrific act of violence. Jerry Salters, who was an officer on the case in 2001 and is now currently the Athens-Clarke County Police Chief, said that he was very happy the case was now solved, because he had been hoping for years that the Baker family would get justice. "I remember being there that horrific time," Salters said in a statement. "Seeing this case now full circle, I appreciate the hard work of the detectives from then and now. Knowing that the evidence collected at the time contributed to the arrest today gives me tremendous pride in all the officers who worked this case over the years." Apart from the ACCPD and the Cold Case Unit, other agencies assisted in solving this 2-decade-old crime, including FBI Gainesville RA, FBI Athens RA1, Georgia State Patrol, and the GBI Division of Forensic Sciences. Meanwhile, Tara's memory continues to live on through her loved ones. In May of 2003, 2 years after her death, Tara was posthumously awarded her law degree from UGA's School of Law. Her family, friends, and classmates remember her as a beacon of kindness and inclusivity. She was someone who consistently fought for the less fortunate and often led students to be involved in academic activities. Her family expressed sadness that she would never be able to practice law like she dreamed. Tara's family held a flower memorial service for her on January 20th, 2021, at Camp Memorial Park in Fayetteville, Georgia, where she was buried. The memorial ceremony was sponsored by Safe Campuses Now, an organization based in Athens designed to increase student awareness of crime and prevent campus criminal activity. Tara's tombstone bears an inscription of the scales of justice, as a symbol to honor her belief in justice. Following the arrest, Tara's sister, Meredith Schroeder, fondly remembered Tara as a champion for many people during her short life.
Tara's legacy. She was the champion for so many during her life, albeit short, and through this law, she would continue to help others.
The past few days have been filled with a host of convoluted emotions, as if it were 23 years ago. We grieve, she said. Tara's mother, Virginia Baker, was just as emotional, showing her gratitude to the police and encouraging people in similar situations to not give up hope and to never stop praying. Unfortunately, Tara's father, Lindsay Baker, passed away in 2018 from a stroke, years before he could see his daughter get the justice she deserved. Though the arrest warmed many hearts, that day was still filled with grief and unanswered questions. Why did Faust kill an innocent 23-year-old university student trying to make the best of her life? Had Tara known him and willingly let him into her home? She was someone who always went out of the way to help others, so one can't help but wonder if Faust used this to lure her into his trap. Regardless, Faust will remain behind bars for a long time. We can only hope that he gives the reasons behind his horrifying actions. Even with Faust in custody, any additional tips can be helpful. They can be submitted anonymously by calling 1-800-597-TIPS-8477, dropping a message online at GBI's tip submission page, or through the See Something, Send Something mobile app. On November 27, 1988, a simple missed phone call led to a chilling discovery. Robert Hecht never missed his usual Sunday phone call with his sister. But on that day, he didn't answer. Concerned, his sister called the authorities to check on him at his home on Rio Tagus Road in Punta Gorda, Florida. 2 days later, on November 29th, their fears were tragically confirmed. 58-year-old Robert was found murdered in his own home. What started as a quiet day turned into a horrifying scene. The investigation took a long journey. Unfortunately, the case went cold for nearly 30 years. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, there was a breakthrough. What ultimately led to solving the mystery of who was responsible for Robert Hecht's murder, and why?
A Florida cold case more than 30 years old, now connecting back to a city in North Carolina. Officials now bringing their investigation to Lenore after 58-year-old Robert Hecht was found dead in his Florida residence in 1988.
When the police arrived at the crime scene, they noticed the scene itself was terrifying. Robert lay lifeless on the couch, and there was a heavy glass ashtray next to him, covered in blood.
By the use of an ashtray, a big heavy ashtray that was found in the house.
Throughout the investigation, it was discovered that Robert had been struck in the head several times. It was clear that the ashtray was the murder weapon, but there were no signs of a fight. This meant Robert was likely surprised or attacked from behind. He was found dead a few days after November 27, 1988, when he missed his sister's phone call. In addition to the weapon, the police discovered another clue at the scene of the crime.
Found on the back of his leg was a burnt matchstick and a cigarette butt on the floor.
A single cigarette butt, with potentially big implications on this case. But there was something even more concerning. Robert's brand new Lincoln Town Car was missing. It disappeared completely, adding another layer of mystery to this already puzzling case. As investigators dug deeper, they tried to trace Robert's movements before the murder. Witnesses claimed to have seen him on the evening of November 26, just a day before his death. But there was a new person with him, a man named Ray, described as a white man with a southern accent. He was unfamiliar to Robert's acquaintances. The information about Ray was vague. He said he was from Tennessee and Kentucky, and he had separated from his wife and was living with his 14-year-old daughter. The involvement of this new person, Ray, became more suspicious. Could he have played a role in Robert's murder? Investigators traced Robert's final movements before his death. He was seen with Ray at the Fisherman's Village Oyster Bar in Punta Gorda on the evening of the 26th. Robert had mentioned plans to visit another bar with Ray before going home. This provided a clear timeline and location for Robert's last hours. But Ray remained elusive. His identity was the biggest obstacle in the case. The search for answers went beyond Charlotte County. Then a crucial breakthrough arrived. On November 28, 1988, the police discovered new leads in a nearby town called Lenoir. A man was spotted leaving a store and ditching Robert's stolen car, the Lincoln he'd just bought a month ago. It had been left abandoned on Main Street in Lenoir, North Carolina, over 700 miles from Punta Gorda. This unexpected discovery not only confirmed the theft of the car, but also suggested a potential escape route for the perpetrator. The car, now in the possession of the Lenoir police, became a crucial piece of evidence that could contain important clues. Following the trail of the recovered Lincoln, crime scene investigators meticulously examined the vehicle. Their search uncovered a significant piece of evidence: a single cigarette butt. That cigarette butt was assumed belonged to the theft. The cigarette butts in the car were significant evidence because Robert had a strict rule of no smoking in his car. He never smoked in it himself or allowed anyone else to do so. And this suggested that the cigarette likely wasn't from Robert, but rather a potential breadcrumb left behind by the killer. The investigation was about to take another turn, just as detectives were digging deeper. A new witness came forward, claiming they saw a blonde woman in the passenger seat of the stolen car. This threw the whole investigation for a loop. Who was this woman? Was the blonde woman just a random passenger, or was there more to her presence? Detectives tirelessly interviewed witnesses, searching for any inconsistencies that might lead them to the truth. As days turned into weeks, pressure grew from the media. But the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office remained tight-lipped. The lack of a clear motive, the mysterious Ray, and the sudden appearance of the blonde woman hinted that the crime might have been planned, but went wrong. Robert's family felt deep sadness as their Sunday tradition turned into silence. With no new leads and few clues, the case eventually went cold. But one question lingered in the investigation. Would they ever find Robert's killer? Years went by with the Robert Hecht case remaining unsolved, but hope was revived in September of 2021. Determined to crack the decades-old mystery, Charlotte County cold case detectives re-examined every detail. Investigators gave priority to interviewing witnesses, especially those who could provide information about the elusive Ray. During the initial investigation, details emerged about Ray claiming to be from Tennessee and Kentucky, and being separated with a daughter was just a minimum information. Limitations in technology at the time hindered progress in the investigation. This seemingly normal information wasn't enough to narrow down the suspect pool, but it held the key to unlocking the truth in 2021. With advancements in DNA technology, the cold case detectives saw renewed hope. In September of 2021, the evidence was reevaluated. Both cigarette butts were submitted for DNA analysis. To the detectives' surprise, they discovered that DNA from the same person was present on both cigarettes. This discovery was monumental. It confirmed that the person who attacked Robert in his home and stole his car was the same person. But a crucial element remained missing: an identity for this DNA profile. The detectives, with renewed determination, searched the Combined DNA Index System, a national database for DNA profiles, but their search found no results. This meant the perpetrator wasn't linked to any previous criminal activity. Then they took the investigation a step further by submitting the results for genealogical examination. This innovative technique uses DNA to trace an individual's ancestry, potentially leading to matches with relatives within a database. But it was a risk. It offered a path forward where traditional methods had failed. But the risk paid off. A match was discovered. It belonged to a family member from Tennessee. With this new profound discovery, a geological connection was established. Detectives conducted interviews, studied family trees, and made direct comparisons with family members. This discovery, combined with information about Ray's 14-year-old daughter, eventually led them to identify the man they had been searching for: Kenneth Ray Miller, who was 36 years old when Robert Hecht was murdered. The revelation of Ray Miller's name sent shockwaves through the investigation. Witness interviews were conducted once again, this time with photographs of Ray in hand, and the results were chilling. Those who had previously encountered Ray on that fateful evening of November 26, 1988, positively identified him from the photographs. The identification wasn't the only bombshell dropped by the witnesses. After seeing Ray's image, one witness disclosed further details. They had not only seen Ray with Robert on the evening of November 26th, but had also spotted him in Robert's home the following morning, November 27th, after the crime. This proved that Ray wasn't just an acquaintance. He appeared to be comfortable enough to spend the night at Robert's residence. The witness described seeing him draped on the end of the living room couch, the same couch where Robert's lifeless body was later found. However, a cruel twist of fate emerged. When detectives looked deeper into Kenneth Ray Miller, they found that he had passed away in 2007, at the age of 55, of natural causes. This identification brought a sense of closure, but it also left a void. The unanswered questions surrounding Robert's final moments and the motive behind the murder. Despite this setback, the investigation continued, and a background check on Ray revealed a disturbing truth. A past filled with violent crimes. Aggravated crimes such as battery, burglary, arson, these were just a few of the offenses that were a part of his history. This violent streak painted a chilling portrait of the man who had spent his final hours with Robert. On March 22, 2024, after a relentless pursuit of justice spanning over 3 decades, the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit officially closed the case. The closure, however, was bittersweet, with the blonde woman not being found and the killer not alive to face justice. It was a closure by the death of the offender. Even after decades, advancements in technology and the relentless pursuit of truth can bring closure to families yearning for answers. Though the mystery may not be fully solved, the identification of Kenneth Ray Miller ensures that Robert Hecht's family has some peace.